Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we uncover the darkest, most heartbreaking facts hidden deep inside the world of Bloodborne. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The doll was built from grief. Before there was a hunter's dream, before there was a hunt, there was a man named Gehrman and a woman named Lady Maria. She was his most gifted student, a hunter of extraordinary ability who came to Yharnam from Cainhurst, one of the first to answer the call of the hunt. And somewhere in those early nights of blood and fire, Gehrman fell deeply in love with her, not in the easy, reciprocated way, in the desperate, unspoken way that goes unacknowledged for years until it festers into something else entirely. Maria never returned those feelings. She was fond of her teacher, perhaps even admired him, but she was no one's possession. When Maria disappeared following the atrocities at the fishing hamlet, Gehrman was shattered. The doll that tends your wounds and levels your character in the hunter's dream was not created out of companionship or care. She was created from obsession. Gehrman fashioned her in Maria's exact likeness. Same face, same voice, same lumen flower brooch on her collar, and prayed to a great one to give her life. What he received was not Maria. What he received was a hollow, gentle echo of her, incapable of possessing any of the fire or pain that had made the real woman who she was. It is said that Gehrman was overjoyed with the doll at first, then grew indifferent. The face was right, everything else was wrong, and so she sits in the hunter's dream to this day, smiling softly, as a monument to one man's inability to let go. The music that linked two tragedies. One of the most quietly devastating discoveries in all of Bloodborne is hidden inside something you might use as a minor tool in an early boss fight: the tiny music box. The item description tells you that it plays a song shared between a husband and a wife, with two names faintly written on the inside of its lid: Viola and Gascoigne. Viola would play it for Gascoigne when his bloodlust overcame his reason, using the melody to pull him back from the edge of beasthood, to remind him who he was and who he loved. The tragedy, of course, is that the night Viola went searching for her missing husband, she forgot to take the music box with her. She found him in the Tomb of Uden, surrounded by the corpses of huntsmen he had dismembered, already too far gone to recognize her. But what the item description alone cannot tell you is the name of the song when you play the music box in the game. The melody that drifts out is called Lullaby for Murgo, the very same haunting theme that plays during the boss fight against Murgo's wet nurse near the end of the game. It is the same song. Gascoigne and Viola's love song is a lullaby for a dead Great One's child. Whether this is a deep lore connection or simply a musical motif from software wove through the game's soundscape, its effect is chilling. And after you defeat Murgo's wet nurse, Viola's corpse, which had been lying on a rooftop in the Tomb of Uden for the entire game, simply vanishes, as if silencing the nightmare also silenced the last echo of her. Gehrman's desperate contract. The three endings of Bloodborne each peel away a different layer of the same decaying truth, and none of them are comfortable. To understand what Gehrman truly is, you have to find the third umbilical cord hidden in the abandoned old workshop, a crumbling mirror image of the hunter's dream tucked beneath the healing church. Its description reads that every Great One loses its child and yearns for a surrogate, and that this particular cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. The word conceived carries two meanings in that sentence. On the surface, it suggests creation, but it also means pregnancy. And Bloodborne's obsession with birth, wombs, and the anguish of lost children makes that second meaning impossible to ignore. Based on what we know, the Moon Presence lost a child it could not replace and sought a surrogate. Gehrman, grieving and broken after Maria's disappearance, reached out, or was reached, by this pale cosmic entity and struck a bargain. He would guide hunters through the dream. In return, the dream would exist. In return, never die. In return, he would never escape. What started as a desperate act of a grieving man became an eternal prison. And for what may be centuries, Gehrman has sat in his wheelchair in the dream's garden, watching hunter after hunter come and go, unable to follow a single one of them into peace. The girl in the window's full story. Most hunters who played through Bloodborne's central Yharnam will remember the small girl's voice, drifting from a high window, asking you to find her mother. If you choose to bring her the red jeweled brooch you find on Viola's corpse, she begins to cry and falls silent. If you direct her to the relative safety of Uden Chapel, a tragedy even worse than her mother's death awaits her. A giant boar that roams the Eden Chapel sewers will find her and eat her. If instead you direct her to Iosefka's clinic, she is transformed by the imposter Iosefka into a celestial minion, no longer human at all. There is a third path. If you say nothing to her, do nothing at all, she may outlast the hunt on her own. But the true horror of this quest line lives in what happens if you give her the brooch and then return later. She is gone. If you press further through the area, past the ladders, through the alleyway, you find her older sister. The older sister, having heard nothing from her little sibling, asks if you know anything. If you show her the young girl's blood-stained ribbon, she climbs to the top of the ladder outside their family home and throws herself off. The entire bloodline of the Gascoigne family, father, mother, 2 daughters, is erased, one by one, most of them because of the hunter's interference. The game shows you this without commentary, without judgment, and without resolution. Maria's weapon and what throwing it away meant. In the fishing hamlet at the bottom of a well, you can find the rakuyo, Lady Maria's primary weapon. Its description tells you that it is the favored weapon of a hunter of renown, one who discovered it in the fishing hamlet and treated it with great care. The description also notes that Maria eventually forfeited the weapon, casting it into the well when she could no longer stomach it. That detail matters enormously. Maria came from Canehurst, a place that reveled in blood weaponry, in the power of the vile bloods, in soaking the blade in red. Despite that heritage, she chose the rakuyo specifically because it required skill and dexterity rather than blood. It was a deliberate rejection of everything Canehurst stood for. She didn't want to fight with inherited power. She wanted to earn every victory herself. Then came the fishing hamlet, and the atrocities committed there in the name of Bergenwerth's research, and whatever role Maria played in the slaughter of those villagers and the desecration of the beached Great One course. The rakuyo had been there. Her hands had held it during those acts, and she could no longer bear to hold it afterward. She threw it into a well. Then she returned to the astral clock tower and, based on every piece of evidence available, slit her own throat. Her spirit was pulled into the hunter's nightmare along with every hunter who had participated in the massacre, condemned to guard a secret she had spent the rest of her living days trying to forget. The orphan's cry at the end of the world. At the very end of the hunter's nightmare, past the fishing hamlet where fishermen pray to the corpse of a great one, on a rocky beach, You find the orphan of Kos. He drops from the womb of the dead goddess as you approach, screaming something that sounds like a newborn's wail, but is unmistakably filled with rage. The orphan is holding an object that looks at first like a weapon, but is actually the placenta. A great amorphous mass of flesh he carries as both sword and shield. He beats you with the remnants of his own birth. What the game does not tell you explicitly, but what the environment and item descriptions imply, is that Kos was already dead when the Bergenwerth scholars arrived at the fishing hamlet. The Great One had washed ashore on the beach and perished, but within her remains she carried something extraordinary. Her unborn child and the Kos parasite, an eldritch organism that the hamlet's villagers had already begun to venerate. The scholars stripped the corpse. They harvested the Great One's blood, took whatever insight they could extract from the body, and left the hamlet changed forever. Its people had been slowly transforming, taking on amphibious qualities from generations of proximity to the Great One. The scholars accelerated that transformation in terrible ways through their experiments. The orphan of Kos was never born into the waking world. He was born into the nightmare, into a place constructed entirely from the grief and rage of a violated people, a violated goddess, and a child who never should have had to exist. What the Mensis cage really does. In the nightmare of Mensis, you will eventually encounter Mikolash, host of the nightmare, the ranting, fleeing scholar who calls out for eyes on the inside and prays for the wisdom of the cosmos. Throughout the upper levels of Yahar'gul before you reach the nightmare, you can find robed figures wearing large iron cages on their heads. Some of them are carrying lanterns. Some of them are motionless. These are members of the School of Mensis, wearing what is literally called the Mensis cage in item descriptions. The description tells you that the cage is an attempt to beckon a Great One, that the brain of a Mensis scholar is offered to the brain of a Great One, and the cage serves as an aerial, a receiver designed to contact something vast and inhuman. This is what the School of Mensis did to themselves. They performed a ritual involving the cage, and the ritual went catastrophically wrong. The note found near the brain of Mensis, that enormous, pulsating, frenzy-inducing creature found in the nightmare, describes how their brains were stillborn. The cage was meant to open their minds to enlightenment. Instead, it emptied their minds entirely, leaving the walking bodies behind while the intellect was transferred into or consumed by the nightmare. The robed cage figures shuffling through Yahar'gul are not waiting. They are already gone. Only the cages remain, swinging gently, transmitting nothing. The real Iosefka's fate. When you first arrive in Yharnam and pass the sick room, where your blood ministration took place, you will hear a woman's voice through double doors to your left. She calls herself Iosefka. She sounds kind and afraid, and she asks you not to enter. She promises to send blood your way as long as you survive. This is the real Iosefka, a compassionate doctor who was almost certainly practicing legitimate medicine before the night of the hunt, turned her clinic into something else. At some point during the early game, the real Iosefka is replaced by an imposter. The game's credits list both a real Iosefka and a fake Iosefka with two different voice actresses, and players who listen carefully notice the shift in tone and voice. The imposter encourages you to send survivors to the clinic. The lonely old woman, Ariana, anyone you find. Those survivors are transformed into celestial minions and killed. The real Iosefka, based on what the evidence suggests, was the first one transformed. A celestial minion drops her blood vial when killed, and this item, Iosefka's blood vial, has a description praising the compassionate doctor's advanced blood. The real Yasefka, the gentle, frightened woman asking for your help through a locked door, became one of the inhuman things crawling through her own clinic. The imposter then used her name, her rooms, and her doors for the rest of the night. Ariana's terrible burden. Found in Cathedral Ward, Ariana is a woman of easy virtue who gives you her blood if you escort her to the safety of Uden Chapel. On the surface, her questline is one of the more straightforward survivor quests in the game, but each time you take her blood, something is being set in motion. The blood of Ariana. Item's description reads that a member of the old healing church would know her blood is similar indeed to precisely what was once forbidden. The only blood the church has ever designated as forbidden is that of the Canehurst vile bloods. And then there is what Ariana wears, the noble dress, the same aristocratic garment found in the chests of forsaken Canehurst Castle, suggesting her lineage traces back to those blood-cursed nobles. The item description never names Canehurst directly, but between the forbidden blood reference and the dress, the evidence points firmly toward her being a descendant of that line, perhaps without even knowing it herself. But the horror of Ariana's storyline is not her ancestry. It is what happens to her near the end of the game, when the blood moon descends. After you defeat Mikulesh, host of the nightmare, she vanishes from the chapel. A trail of blood leads out of Uden Chapel toward the aqueduct between the tomb of Uden and the Cathedral Ward lamps. Follow it, and you will find her there on the stone floor, having given birth to a small crawling creature, a Great One's child. The 1/3 of umbilical cord that drops from this child names Eden specifically. Every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate, and Odin, the formless Great One, is no different. To think it was corrupted blood which began this eldritch liaison. Ariana's womb was blessed, in the most terrible sense of that word. Adela, the nun's hidden violence. The tragedy of Ariana is made worse by what the game does not show you directly. If you bring both Ariana and Adela the nun to Uden Chapel, the two women share the space. Adela is a healing church nun, devout and frightened, who will also offer you her blood as thanks for saving her. If you accept Ariana's blood 3 times while Adela is present in the chapel, Adela will murder Ariana. You will return to find Ariana's body on the floor of the chapel. There is no cutscene, no dramatic announcement, just Ariana's corpse and Adela standing nearby, refusing to discuss it. The implication woven into the lore is that Adela, deeply indoctrinated by the healing church, considers Ariana's blood, described in the item description as similar to precisely what was once forbidden, to be corrupt and heretical. To offer it to a hunter instead of pure church blood is, in the church's doctrine, an act of spiritual pollution. Adela may have killed Ariana not out of jealousy, though that reading also fits the evidence, but out of fanatical conviction. What both interpretations share is the same uncomfortable truth. The healing church's theology made murder feel righteous to one of its most devout members. It left a very specific and lethal kind of thinking behind in its followers. Alfred's devotion turned to pulp. Alfred is one of the few NPCs in Bloodborne who greets you with warmth. He is cheerful, enthusiastic, and committed to his purpose as a student of Ligarius and an executioner sworn to eradicate the vile bloods of Canehurst. He asks to be your comrade. He means it. His questline seems like a clean, satisfying arc. Meet him, find common purpose, track down the vile bloods together, The last step of Alfred's questline requires you to give him the unopened summons found in Annalise's chambers, which is a letter inviting Alfred's order to Canehurst. If you give it to him, Alfred travels to Canehurst Castle, breaks into Annalise's hidden chamber, and beats her immortal body into a bloody pulp of flesh and splattered gore. This takes considerable effort because she cannot truly die. He knows this. He beats her anyway, reducing her to something barely recognizable, a heap of meat that still technically breathes. If you return to him after, you find Alfred laughing. The laughter is not the easy laugh of the man who greeted you at the start. It is the laugh of a man who has run out of anything else to feel. When you speak to him again, he says he can finally be with his master Logarius in death, and then folds over and dies. He gave everything, his training, his clarity, his warmth, to an act that, in retrospect, accomplished almost nothing. Annalise can be revived at the altar of despair. He destroyed himself for a few hours of the Queen's suffering. The vile blood betrayal at Bergenwerth. To understand why the vile bloods exist and why the Healing Church hates them so completely, you have to trace a single act of treachery back to Bergenwerth. The Canehurst Vile Bloods Covenant description, along with Alfred's dialogue and item descriptions related to the Chickager and Canehurst armour, piece together this story. A scholar of Bergenwerth betrayed his fellows and brought forbidden blood to Canehurst Castle. This was not the sanctified old blood that Lawrence would later use to found the Healing Church. This was something else, a different strain of blood, tainted in ways the Church found abhorrent. It was from this blood that the first of the inhuman vile bloods was born. The castle's nobility drank it, transformed, and became what the Church considered monsters. Beings who fed on hunters' blood, who hungered for the dregs of those who died in the hunt. The scholar who brought it there is never named. The Chickager's description references the Knights of Canehurst who used it and the blood tinge that powered them, but says nothing of origins. One reading suggests the scholar was fleeing Bergenwerth's increasingly controlling intellectual hierarchy, seeking patrons who would allow the research to continue without Willem's restrictions. Another suggests purely mercenary motive. Either way, the blood reached Canehurst, and Canehurst was never the same again. Logarius and his lonely vigil. At the peak of forsaken Canehurst Castle, standing on the highest roof amid the snowstorm and the ruin, is Martyr Logarius, the leader of the executioners, the hunter-cleric sworn to destroy the vile bloods. He was supposed to be the hero of the Canehurst Purge. He and his executioners swept the castle, slaughtered the vile bloods one by one, and achieved what the Healing Church had sent them there to do. Except for one problem. Queen Annalise could not be killed. She had consumed enough blood to become functionally immortal, and rather than report back to the Church that the mission was incomplete, Logarius chose to stay, alone. On the roof of a dead castle in an eternal snowstorm, guarding an illusion he had constructed to seal Annalise away and prevent anyone from reaching her. The crown of illusions, which you used to reveal her hidden chamber, was Logarius's own creation, a tool he left behind in death, as if part of him wanted to be relieved of this duty. The item description of the executioner set speaks of their fervor and their mercilessness, their burning conviction. Logarius had all of that, and spent it guarding one immortal woman in the ruins of an empty castle for longer than any ordinary human lifespan could account for. When you finally put him down, he does not curse you. He lets go, and the crown falls. Mikolash's last words. Mikolash, host of the nightmare, is one of the strangest and most theatrical figures in Bloodborne. A man who spent his life building a school, performing rituals, putting iron cages on the heads of his followers, and praying for the wisdom of the stars. By the time the hunter reaches him in the nightmare of Mensis, Mikolash has been in the nightmare for long enough to have lost most of his grip on coherent thought. He sprints away from you, laughing and babbling, locking doors between you and him, hiding behind mirrors. His famous cry, Arcos, or some say Cosm, do you hear our prayers? Is not dramatic posturing. It is a genuine, desperate plea made by a man who has been reaching toward the cosmos for so long that he has hollowed himself out in the attempt. When you finally corner him and kill him, his final words are, now I'm waking up, I'll forget everything. He says this as if waking from the nightmare is something that happens to him. Not a mercy, but simply the next thing that occurs, the inevitable forgetting that comes when a mind that existed only in the nightmare is finally extinguished. Elsewhere in the nightmare, the phrase etched into the foundation of the world is Master Willem's old warning. We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Mikolash spent his life ignoring that warning, constructing an entire nightmare on top of the ruins it described, and his last thought before forgetting everything is not wisdom or peace, but the simple, mechanical observation of a consciousness ending. He came to the cosmos looking for eyes. He left without a single memory. Rom the veil between worlds, in the moonside lake beneath Bergenwerth, a vast pale creature sits in perfect stillness at the center of the water, surrounded by countless smaller spiders. This is Rom, the vacuous spider. And despite the diminutive, almost pathetic impression she creates, Rom is arguably the most consequential entity in Bloodborne's entire plot. Notes found in Bergenwerth reference the spider hiding all manner of rituals. Another note in Cathedral Ward reads, the spider hides all manner of rituals and keeps our lost master from us. What Rom is hiding is the ritual of the School of Mensis, the process by which the blood moon is being summoned over Yharnam. As long as Rom is alive, the blood moon does not descend, the ritual is invisible, and most of the horrors that await in the game's later stages remain dormant. The moment you kill Rom, everything changes. The blood moon descends immediately. Yahar'gul, the unseen village, fully reveals itself with its terrible cargo of kidnapped citizens and transformed bodies. The sky turns red. Lore scholars read Rom as a Bergenwerth scholar who achieved partial transcendence through contact with the Great One. Mikolash's dialogue references Kos as having granted eyes, and the Bergenwerth lore connects the school's expedition to the fishing hamlet as a likely trigger for the transformation. Her name, Vacuous, suggests emptiness, but the context implies that she is called Vacuous because she will not share what she knows. True enlightenment, one of Bergenwerth's notes reads, need not be shared. The eyes on the inside. Mikolash cries out for eyes on the inside, and this phrase, strange as it sounds in context, is the closest thing the School of Mensis has to a mission statement. The Eye Caril rune, dropped by Master Willem when killed, carries a description that speaks of eyes being implanted in the brain, granting greater insight into the eldritch truth. The Great Ones, to communicate with lesser beings at all, require a different kind of perception, one that exists not on the surface of the skin or even in the physical eyes, but somewhere deeper. The concept of gaining eyes through insight runs throughout Bloodborne's entire system. Insight is the game's measure of how much cosmic truth you have absorbed. As it increases, you begin to see things others cannot. The amygdalae clinging to the cathedral ward buildings become visible. The moon changes. The plain doll gains animation. The Garden of Eyes enemies at Bergenwerth, creatures who have had eyes literally cultivated in the flesh of their skulls, are what happens when Willem's theories were applied directly and catastrophically to human test subjects. They are people whose heads were remade into instruments of perception. Whether any of them found enlightenment inside those new eyes, the game does not say. They seem only to rage. The Healing Church's dirty origin. The Healing Church presents itself to the people of Yharnam as a benevolent institution, the custodian of miraculous blood ministration, the guardian of a population's health and spiritual life. The blood really does heal. The church really was built by people who believed in it. But the blood ministration that built the church and made it powerful was not the church's discovery. It was stolen from the Pthumerians, an ancient civilization that built the labyrinthine chalice dungeons far beneath the city, who had been in direct contact with the Great Ones long before any Yharnamite scholar was born. The Healing Church found the old blood deep in those dungeons, recognized its miraculous properties, and built an empire of dependence around it. Every blood transfusion administered to every pilgrim who traveled to Yharnam for healing was seeding that person with the potential for beasthood. Lawrence, the founder of the Healing Church, was warned by his mentor Master Willem, with words you can still find echoed in the game. We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Fear the old blood. Lawrence ignored it. The Healing Church's entire history is the story of what happens when the warning is ignored at sufficient institutional scale. Eileen's silent mercy. Eileen the Crow is a hunter of hunters, a member of a group bound by oath to cull hunters who have gone blood-addled. She wears black feathered attire and moves through Yharnam like a quiet conscience. Her questline is entirely missable, encountered only if you find her crouched in a specific alcove near the cathedral ward and recognize the significance of the Blade of Mercy rune she carries. What the Blade of Mercy item description reveals is the philosophy that drives her entire order. A hunter who has become a beast is still a hunter. The mercy is the kill. It is not punishment. It is release. Eileen is not executing criminals. She's performing a kind of euthanasia for people she recognizes as her own kind, people who made the same choice she made and arrived at a different end. The Crow Hunter badge she drops or gives you describes a hunter of hunters and notes that they were among the first hunters to become aware of the hunt's terrible repetition. Eileen chose to stay in it, not to hunt beasts, but to make sure that the hunters who fell to beasts received a final mercy rather than simply haunting the streets as monsters wearing familiar faces. Her last mark in the game is Henrik, Gascoigne's old partner, who has gone blood-addled after finding his partner's corpse. She needs your help to finish him. The poetic weight of that detail is almost unbearable. Gascoigne killed by a new hunter. Henrik destroyed by grief over losing Gascoigne. Eileen there to end the chain. What Henrik's roar reveals. Henrik is an old hunter, Gascoigne's longtime partner, and one of the only NPCs whose emotional state you witness, without any dialogue. After you kill Gascoigne and move through the tomb of Odin, you will encounter Henrik during Eileen's questline. He stands over the bodies, Gascoigne's remains, Viola's missing or present body, depending on your actions, and performs the roar gesture. Just the roar. Then he turns hostile. The roar gesture in Bloodborne is typically associated with combat bravado. In this context, coming from an old hunter standing over the corpse of his partner of decades. It reads as pure anguish stripped of any other outlet. There is speculation, supported by the young girl's dialogue about her grandfather and Henrik's proximity, that Henrik is Viola's father. If so, he's standing over the bodies of both his daughter and his dearest colleague. The gesture is all he has, and then you, or Eileen, cut him down. The item set Henrik wears is called the Old Hunter set, and its description notes that Henrik was a veteran of hunts beyond count, a partner of Gascoigne's who hunted on long after his partner's fall. His stubborn longevity, the description implies, was itself a kind of madness, staying in a hunt that had already taken everything from him. The brain of Mensis, and what it cost. Suspended above a pit in the nightmare of Mensis, visible through a lit window that causes instant frenzy build-up if you look at it directly, is the brain of Mensis, a colossal, pulsating mass that was once the collective consciousness of Mikolash's scholars. The Mensis Cage ritual was designed to offer the brain of a human scholar to the brain of a great one, to create a connection between the two. It succeeded, after a fashion. The scholars who participated had their intellects drawn out and deposited into the nightmare, leaving their bodies to shuffle through Yahar'gul as empty, caged automatons. What remained was the brain, a physical manifestation of those extracted minds, swollen and transformed by contact with cosmic intellect that the human brain was simply not designed to contain. The eye rune dropped by Master Willem, and the 3 moon runes found in the nightmare are all connected to this concept of the brain as receiver. When you find a lever in a side area of Murgo's loft and pull it, the chains holding the brain snap and it falls into the abyss below, broken, helpless, but not dead. It survives in the darkness. You can descend to it via a cage elevator, and if you use the make contact gesture in front of its large eye for long enough, it gifts you the strongest moon rune in the game. That rune's description reads that the Great Ones inhabiting the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called upon. The brain was not a monster the Mensis scholars created. It was a great one they found in the nightmare, and they chained it to a tower and used its gaze as a weapon. It was both their prize and their prisoner, crying frenzy into the air from above the fortress they built around it. The Blood Moon's oldest warning. One of the most important notes in Bloodborne is found on a bookshelf in Bergenwerth, the old university whose scholars started everything. It reads, "When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred. And when the great ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child." This note is not a record of something that already happened. It reads like a prophecy, or perhaps a clinical observation from someone who had already seen the pattern repeat. The red moon descending over Yharnam is not just an aesthetic detail. It is mechanically tied to transformation. It is the blood moon rising that causes the beasts of Yahar'gul to emerge fully, that triggers Arana's terrible pregnancy, that transforms the city from a place of nighttime hunts into something far stranger and more cosmic. Master Willem understood this. He wrote it down. And then his most gifted student, Lawrence, took the old blood up from the chalice dungeons anyway, built the healing church, distributed blood ministration to thousands of people, and made the prophecy inevitable. The note on the shelf is either the beginning of an unfinished warning or the epitaph of a man who saw what was coming and could not stop it. Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, at the very end of the Chalice dungeon questline, deep beneath the optional labyrinths that most players never fully explore, you encounter a woman standing outside the final boss chamber. She wears elaborate Pthumerian robes and holds a candle. She is Yharnam, queen of the Pthumerians. She watches you enter the boss room with an expression of absolute grief. The boss fight that follows is against the Blood Queen herself, though she barely seems to fight as a matter of will. Her battle feels more like an endurance of the encounter than a genuine attempt to destroy you. When she is defeated, she drops the Yharnam stone, a key item whose description reads that it is a sacred heirloom that contains the Queen's sleeping consciousness. No one has ever found a use for it. It sits in the key item's inventory described as important, containing the awareness of a queen who's been entombed in dreams and stones and labyrinths for longer than recorded history. The Yharnam, the city, is named after this queen, or perhaps named after herself, as one of the Pthumerians' most sacred figures. The city of blood healing built above the ruins of her civilization carries the name of a woman who can be found weeping in the deepest dungeon beneath it, watching a hunter kill what remains of her body, unable to do anything else. The abandoned workshop's confession, hidden beneath the main healing church workshop, accessible by dropping down through the scaffolding and rope platforms of the workshop tower, a descent that requires careful navigation of wooden planks over a deadly fall, is the abandoned old workshop. It is a decaying, perfect mirror of the hunter's dream. The same layout, the same workbench, the same graves in the garden. This is where the hunter's dream comes from. This is the original. Everything in the dream is a replica of this place, built from Gehrman's memory and grief, and the moon presence's power. The abandoned old workshop contains two of the most significant items in the entire game: the doll set armor pieces, the clothing worn by the plain doll, and the third umbilical cord, the one that confirms the moon presence's role in creating the dream. The grave in the garden outside corresponds to a grave visible in the hunter's dream. The plain doll, when your insight is high enough, sometimes stands at that grave in the dream as if mourning. What she is mourning exactly, whether she has any genuine grief, or whether she is simply enacting behavior that Gehrman built into her, is one of Bloodborne's most quietly unanswerable questions. The item description of the doll set describes it as an elegant dress worn by a doll left in an abandoned workshop. Note the phrasing, left, not placed, left, as if she was forgotten there. The cleric beast's former name. The first major boss of Bloodborne is a colossal, screaming beast perched on the Great Bridge in central Yharnam. A creature so warped by the beast plague that it barely resembles the human it once was. This creature is called the Cleric Beast, and that name is not incidental. It was a member of the Healing Church clergy. The Cleric Beast's roar and movement carry traces of something tormented, something that once inhabited a human body and wore the vestments of religious office. The Healing Church preached that blood was sacred, that it healed, that it brought the faithful closer to the Great Ones. The Cleric Beast is the end result of what believing that too completely looks like. The Church's own blood ministration, applied to one of its own clergy, transformed a man of faith into a screaming monster on a bridge. The Church could not acknowledge this. They could not hunt it themselves without admitting what they had done and what they were. So it remained on the bridge, waiting for whoever came that night, as a testament to the institution that created and then abandoned it. The beast rune found in Yharnam's depths notes that those who take on too much of the beast essence lose their human shape entirely. The cleric beast took on the beast essence willingly through the Church's own sacrament. The amygdalae that were always there. One of Bloodborne's most brilliant environmental revelations occurs as your inchit score rises through the early game. In Cathedral War, there are enormous stone columns and architectural alcoves that seem unusually shaped, too organic, too tentacled at the extremities. When your insight reaches a certain threshold, you see what has always been there. Massive, multi-eyed, tentacled beings called amygdalae, clinging to the sides of buildings and arches, completely motionless, completely silent. They were there during every visit to Cathedral Ward. They were always there. You simply lacked the perceptual capacity to see them. The amygdala's name comes directly from the part of the human brain that processes fear. The amygdalae have been described as potentially being something like organs of the cosmos, rather than individual entities, as if each one is a single sensory node of something vast and otherwise imperceptible. One of the most unsettling reads is that the amygdalae are not unique to Yharnam. The implication is that they are simply everywhere, clinging to the surfaces of all human structures, and that we cannot see them because we lack sufficient insight. The world of Bloodborne asks the question, what if the reason we don't see the monsters is not because the monsters are absent, but because we are not yet evolved enough to perceive them? The hunting party that destroyed a village. The fishing hamlet did not begin as a place of horror. It was a community of fisherfolk who lived in proximity to something remarkable. The beached corpse of the Great One Kos, whose body had washed onto their shores and whose presence had slowly transformed them over generations. They had parasites in their flesh that carried traces of cosmic power. They ate the parasites as food and used them as candles. They prayed to Kos on the beach. And then the Bergenwerth hunting party arrived. The party's composition is implied but not directly confirmed. Lady Maria was among them. German may have been there. And Master Willem is referenced in connection with the event. They came to harvest the Great One's blood and extract whatever insight could be pulled from Kos's remains. What they did to the hamlet's inhabitants in the process is described obliquely in item descriptions and NPC dialogue, but the results are visible in the Old Hunters DLC in the form of patients in the research hall. People who are subjected to experimental procedures, who have tubes in their heads and eyes where eyes should not be, who moan and stumble through a building meant to look like a place of healing. These were the people of the fishing hamlet, taken and used. The curse that trapped every hunter who participated in the massacre was not imposed by anyone with authority. It was laid by Kos herself, or by the grief encoded in her corpse. The orphan of Kos's curse. When you finally defeat the orphan of Kos at the end of the hunter's nightmare, a terrible voice speaks over the dying creature. A voice that does not belong to the orphan and is never fully explained. The words are a command and a condemnation. Cursed you, filthy beasts. These are the first coherent words spoken by anyone directly from the perspective of Kos's consciousness in the entire game. The orphan screams throughout the fight, but this final phrase comes from somewhere deeper. It comes from a mother, or from a goddess, or from the concentrated grief of an entire violated people speaking through the last remnant of a great one, who had no defense against the scholars who came to her shore. The phrase is brief and absolute. It does not distinguish between you and the original hunting party. From Kos's perspective, if a great one can be said to have a perspective, all hunters are the same. The hunt is the same. The blood hunger is the same. Defeating the orphan and lifting the curse on the nightmare liberates the hunters trapped there, including potentially Lady Maria's spirit. But the note at the end of the Simon the Harrowed quest line, found near the orphan's arena, reads as an epitaph for the whole terrible story. You were the only one who could hear their cries. The orphan was never a monster. It was a child crying in a nightmare, and the nightmare was built to contain that cry forever. Simon the Harrowed and his long failure. Among the hunters trapped in the hunter's nightmare is one called Simon the Harrowed, carrying a bow blade and looking for a way to end the nightmare without becoming a part of its violence. Simon is perhaps the most tragic figure in the Old Hunters DLC, not because his story is spectacular, but because it is so entirely mundane in its failure. He came to the fishing hamlet before the player, trying to uncover what happened there and find a way to liberate the trapped souls. He was there first. He failed. He may have been responsible for Lady Maria's physical death. Cut content and his position in the DLC suggest he killed her before the events of the Hunter's Nightmare began, explaining how the astral clock tower door was accessible to him. He found the fishing hamlet. He saw what happened. He did not stop it, could not undo it, and was too late for everyone. The bow blade he carries, the only bow-type weapon in the game, is a gesture toward a different kind of hunting. Precise, distant, unwilling to get blood on the hands. Simon came to Yharnam's nightmare wanting to fix things cleanly, from a distance, with skill and care. The nightmare does not allow for clean fixes. When you find his body at the end of the DLC, near the Orphan of Kos's arena, he leaves you the underground cell key and a note. He found a way to help. In the end, that is all he managed. The Research Hall's silent testimony. The Research Hall in the Old Hunters DLC is a building that presents itself as a hospital and is, in fact, a site of systematic atrocities. The patients shuffle through its hallways with their heads tilted upward, stumbling toward light sources, their eyes and heads grotesquely modified. Some of them have tubes inserted through the tops of their skulls. Some have lost the ability to stand upright. The description of the living string, an item dropped in the nightmare, tells you that it is an internal organ of a great one, offered as the eye in the ritual meaning of the word, the perceiving organ that grants insight. The Healing Church's hypothesis, built on Willem's original theory about gaining eyes on the inside, led them to perform surgical modifications on living subjects designed to force those subjects into perception of the cosmic. The patients in the research hall are those subjects. The choir was responsible. Their uniform is visible throughout the building, as is their equipment and their symbolism. What the research hall teaches you, if you read it carefully, is that the same church that distributed miraculous blood healing to pilgrims from across the world was simultaneously performing irreversible brain surgery on captive patients in a locked building at the top of a clock tower hidden in a nightmare, trying to build people into receiving instruments for Great One Communion. Both things are equally true of the same institution. The living failures were people. The boss fight before Lady Maria in the Old Hunters DLC is against a group called the Living Failures. Enormous, blue-veined humanoid figures that attack you in a group inside a circular garden filled with lumen flowers. They call upon cosmic energy and launch starlight at you. They are deeply strange and feel almost out of place compared to the horror of everything surrounding them. Their name and their environment explain what they are. These are the choir's attempts to become kin, beings elevated beyond humanity through arcane communion with the Great Ones. The patients in the research hall above were being prepared for ascension, and the living failures are what ascension looked like in practice. Some of them made it part way. None of them made it fully. They are called failures not to mock them, but to describe the clinical outcome of the experiment. incomplete transformation, partial transcendence, bodies that grew enormous and starlit but kept stumbling, kept reaching for something they could never quite touch. The Lumenwood garden where you find them, with its softly glowing flowers and its circular, almost ceremonial layout, was designed as the final stage of their transformation, a place to either bloom into something new or wither having fallen short. They have been there a long time. They circle the garden still. Lawrence and the skull that burns. In the Hunter's Nightmare, there is an item called Lawrence's skull. It is the skull of the man who founded the Healing Church. You can bring it to the skull's counterpart item found in the Grand Cathedral, a skull-like relic kept by the church to trigger an optional boss fight against Lawrence, the first vicar. In this fight, Lawrence appears as a partial beast, his lower body consumed entirely by fire and transformed into something enormous and bestial, while his upper half retains almost human features, reaching toward the player with recognizable arms and hands. His reaching is the key to understanding what he represents. His item description calls him the first vicar of the Healing Church and says that he was consumed by the same beast blood he administered to others, the blood he brought up from the Chalice dungeons over his mentor's explicit objections. The skull burns in Yharnam. The skull burns in the Nightmare. The man who started everything, who brought the blood to the surface, who built the church, who set the scourge in motion, is trapped in a burning half-beast form in the Nightmare he helped create, still reaching, still unable to escape what he chose, unable to look away from what he did. The Garden of Eyes experiment. In the grounds of Bergenwerth, wandering slowly through the tall grass and water features surrounding the university building, are creatures that look almost human from a distance. They walk upright. They wear clothing. When they turn toward you, however, you see what has been done to them. Dozens of eyes have been grown directly into the flesh of their skulls. Eyes cover their heads in clusters, some open, some half-lidded, all weeping. These are called Garden of Eyes enemies, and they were people, scholars, students or volunteers, on whom Master Willem tested his theories about forced perception. The eye rune's description, which Willem drops when killed, speaks of eyes being implanted in the brain, and these creatures are the physical literalization of that concept. Whether they see more than ordinary humans is impossible to say from the outside. They seem to be in considerable distress, constantly turning toward any source of light or movement, their perception heightened to the point of agony. The Bergenwerth grounds, with their tranquil lake and ornamental features, were clearly meant to be a place of serene scholarship. The Garden of Eyes wandering through it now suggests what happened when the scholarship stopped being serene. The Unseen Village's stolen people, Yahar'gul, the Unseen Village, is the base of operations for the School of Menses, but for most of the game's first half, it is something else entirely. A place where people simply disappear. Before the blood moon descends, if you are killed by the large hooded figures called Snatchers, who appear in various corners of central Yharnam, you wake up not in the hunter's dream, but in a cell in Yahar'gul. The Snatchers are collecting people. They are gathering living humans and bringing them to the School of Menses for use in the ritual that will beckon the blood moon closer. The cells beneath Yahar'gul contain cages with bodies in them, and the architecture of the place is unmistakably built for containment and observation. The villagers taken to Yahar'gul did not go to be healed or enlightened. They went to be used as components of a ritual they knew nothing about, conducted by scholars who believed their ends entirely justified the means. After the blood moon descends and the full Yahar'gul becomes accessible, The streets are full of bell-ringing women, kidnapped survivors who have been transformed into instruments that summon otherworld hunters. They ring bells because the nightmare needs them to ring bells. There is something deeply human in their posture, even as they perform their incomprehensible function. The Pthumerians' ancient blood. Long before Yharnam existed, before Bergenwerth, before the Healing Church, there was a civilization in the labyrinths beneath the earth. The Pthumerians, who built the Chalice dungeons and lived alongside great ones in ways that no subsequent culture has approached. Their queen, Yharnam, was entombed in the deepest part of the dungeon system. Their blood, carried forward into certain descendants like Ariana of Cathedral Ward, still holds traces of their connection to the Great Ones. The Pthumerian enemies encountered deep in the Chalice dungeons are not beasts in the conventional sense. They are something older and stranger. Beings who inhabited a world where the boundary between human and Great One was thinner than it has ever been since. The Loran civilization, references to which appear in various item descriptions including the Loran Silver Beast and the Loran Dark Beast enemies, was a culture that descended from the Pthumerians and similarly burned itself out in pursuit of the Great One's power. The pattern is not accidental. The Chalice dungeons are the history of every civilization that touched the blood and what it cost them. Laid out in descending layers beneath the city that repeated the mistake most recently. The blood of Adela's warning. The description of the blood of Adela item. The blood you receive from the Healing Church nun in Oden Chapel. Describes it as thick blood. This seems complimentary at first. The Healing Church values pure, thick, uncorrupted blood. But the sedative item, given to you by the lonely old woman in the chapel, carries a description noting that the sedative is made of thick human blood, implying that what passes as medicine in Yharnam is, in some cases, blood extracted from the population it claims to serve. The relationship between the Healing Church's blood ministration and the blood it draws from its congregation is never made explicit, but the item descriptions hint at a circular economy. Blood is given freely to the sick, and blood is drawn back from the population in various forms. Adela, the devout nun, who may murder Ariana out of religious conviction, is herself a source of thick medicinal blood that the Church would consider valuable. She is both a believer in the Church's doctrine and a resource for it. The two positions are never in tension for her, because the Church has made devotion indistinguishable from service. The Bloody Crow of Cainhurst. Among the various hostile hunters encountered throughout Bloodborne, one of the most dangerous and lore-significant is the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, a hunter wearing Cainhurst armor and wielding a Chikage, who attacks you in the Tomb of Oden during Eileen's questline. This is the hunter Eileen has been tracking. What makes this figure remarkable is Queen Annalise's claim that she and the player are the only two vile bloods remaining after the executioner's purge of Cainhurst. If Annalise is correct, and she has no apparent reason to lie, then the Bloody Crow is either not a true vile blood, despite the armor and weapon, or was a vile blood who managed to leave Cainhurst before the purge and went undetected for long enough to operate freely as a hunter. The Shikage's item description notes that it is a weapon forged in a distant land and used by the Cainhurst Knights, its blade drinking the blood of its wielder to increase its power. The Bloody Crow drinks his own blood willingly, operating outside any faction's blessing or condemnation, hunting and killing in the name of nothing but the hunt itself. He is what a vile blood looks like when removed from the context of the court and the covenant. Still blood-hungry, still lethal, still wearing the badge of a dead kingdom. What the White Church costume reveals. The White Church set description tells you that it is the attire of the more advanced Healing Church hunters, those who have progressed beyond the initial hunter training. But it also notes something specific about the uniform's design. The distinctive eye covering worn by the most advanced church members is inherited from the blindfold tradition of Master Willem, a gesture of acknowledgement toward the teacher, whose methods the church's highest tier continues. This is significant because it reveals that even as the church drifted away from Willem's scholarly approach and toward organized religion, political power, and blood distribution, its inner sanctum never stopped paying tribute to the old man. The choir's blindfolds, the White Church's eye covering, even the symbol of Bergenwerth continued to mark the bodies of the institution that had, according to any institutional history, surpassed and abandoned it. Willem is still there, in the stitching of every high-ranking church uniform, as either a genuine act of reverence or the most institutionalized form of credit-taking, claiming the wisdom of a man whose specific warnings the church spent its entire existence ignoring. The celestial emissary's peaceful deception. In the upper cathedral ward, past the door that requires the upper cathedral key, and through a series of increasingly cosmic horrors, you encounter the celestial emissary, a cluster of small blue humanoid figures that coalesce into a single large form for the boss fight. These small figures are celestial mobs, and they are the same type of creature that the imposter Ayosefka has been creating in her clinic by transforming the survivors you send to her. They are people, or they were. The celestial emissary boss fight is unusual because the small figures that surround the large one during the encounter are not hostile. They wander around peacefully, occasionally buffing the main form, but never attack the player directly. This could be read as a design choice, but it also says something about the nature of these transformed beings, that even after complete transformation into alien starlit forms, something of their original temperament persists. The lonely old woman, transformed into a celestial mob, was described as disdainful of outsiders, but fundamentally harmless. Perhaps that harmlessness carried through the transformation. The choir's experiment created beings that are technically closer to great ones than humans, but they still wander peacefully through a building filled with horror, like villagers who simply never found their way home. Ebrietas and the Left Behind. The description of the Great Is Chalice, the chalice that connects to the Is Tomb network, where the choir eventually encountered their most significant discovery, describes Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, as a great one who was left behind by the other great ones. The choir found her in the deepest Is dungeon. She was alone. The word left behind is haunting in its implications. Every other great one in Bloodborne is either dead, imprisoned, pursued, or fighting. Ebrietas is simply alone, in the dark, where the others left her. Why was she left behind? The game does not say, and one reading suggests she was too weak or too immature to ascend with the rest. Another reading is that she chose to remain. Perhaps her role was to be discovered, to be the bridge between the great ones and the humans who were reaching toward them. The choir's relationship with Ebrietas became increasingly complicated over time. They studied her, they used her blood, they imitated her arcane arts with the auger of Ebrietas. The item description for that arcane art describes it as a remnant of the mysteries Bergenwerth once saw, a calling of a piece of Ebrietas herself through the phantasm shell. She lent herself to the research. She allowed it. Whether this was desperation, loneliness, or genuine affection for the scholars who at least acknowledged her existence. The abandoned Great One deep in the Is dungeons remains one of Bloodborne's most quietly melancholy figures. The Hunter's Dream Fire. After you defeat Murgo's wet nurse and free Murgo from the nightmare, you return to the Hunter's Dream to find it burning. The building is on fire. The doll looks out over the flames with her usual expression of gentle concern and tells you Gehrman is waiting. This fire is not random environmental damage. According to Gehrman's dialogue in The Hunter's Dream, it was Gehrman himself who set the dream on fire, following the death of Murgo. The dream exists in relationship with the nightmare, and when the nightmare is slain, when Murgo's crying is finally silenced, the dream begins to destabilize. Gehrman set his own prison alight. This could be an act of desperation, or it could be the most coherent thing Gehrman has done in whatever passes for his subjective eternity in the dream. The prison was ending anyway. The fire is not destruction, it is acceleration. A man who has been unable to die for longer than anyone can account for, watching the cage that has held him finally beginning to open, chose to hurry the process. The burning Hunter's Dream is one of the most visually striking moments in the game, and one of the most quietly personal. Gehrman, at the end of his long captivity, tried to burn his way out. The blood-starved beast's poisoned body. In the old locked church of Old Yharnam, the blood-starved beast lurches through the darkness, trailing rags that were once wrappings and moaning through the darkness. Its attacks inflict poison. Its body is coated in it. The lore note in the Fextra Life wiki and various item descriptions point toward the reason. Old Yharnam was not destroyed by the standard beast scourge. It was first struck by a mysterious illness called ashen blood, described in the antidote item description as a severe form of blood contamination distinct from the beast plague. This ashen blood preceded the transformation into beasts, and the antidote description notes that it could only be temporarily suppressed. When the people of Old Yharnam inevitably transformed into beasts, they did so from already poisoned bodies. The blood-starved beast is one such creature, a beast that carries the original ashen blood contamination in its body alongside all the standard beast transformation. Its very blood is toxic. The church tried to contain Old Yharnam, burned it, and sealed it away. The blood-starved beast is what they sealed inside. Not just a beast, but the evidence of a failure of care so complete that the community it consumed had been dying before it ever became monstrous. Erden, the formless god. Throughout Bloodborne, one Great One is referenced everywhere but never seen: Uden. The tomb of Uden is in central Yharnam. The Uden Chapel is the survivor sanctuary. The formless Uden rune, one of the most commonly found runes in the game, is named for this entity. The description of the formless Uden rune tells you that Uden is the only Great One who has no physical form, who exists purely as sound and blood and the resonance between them. Every other Great One has a body, or had one. Uden has never been embodied. This makes Oden's influence in the game simultaneously ubiquitous and completely invisible. The note found in Bergenwerth reads, "When the Great Ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child." The Eden Writhe rune, found in the game and describing an arcane method of replenishment through blood, carries implications about Uden's particular relationship to blood and reproduction. Several fan theories propose that Uden is the entity responsible for the pregnancies visited upon women throughout the game's story, that the formless god's influence, mediated through the blood that saturates Yharnam, reaches into the bodies of those who carry it. Whether that reading holds or not, The game's design makes Udin's absence feel like a presence, a god defined entirely by what it leaves behind rather than what it shows you. The price of high insight. Bloodborne's insight mechanic is one of the most thematically coherent game systems ever designed. As your insight increases, the world changes around you. At baseline, Yharnam is a city of beasts and hunters. As insight climbs, the amygdalae appear on the cathedral buildings. The plain doll begins to speak when she previously sat silent. The ambient audio in certain areas changes to incorporate inhuman sounds. At very high insight scores, new dialogue becomes audible. The singing of creatures you could previously only see, the whispers of things not fully visible. But the game also signals that high insight is not unambiguously good. Enemies deal more damage to players with high insight. The brain of Mensis' frenzy aura becomes more potent against minds that are more open. The insight stat's dual nature. The more you know, the more vulnerable you are. Encodes a specific philosophy about the relationship between understanding and safety. The scholars who pursued enlightenment at Bürgenwerth and the school of Mensis gained extraordinary perception. They also lost their minds, their bodies, their humanity. High insight in Bloodborne costs you the comfortable ignorance of the early game. The world gets stranger, louder, more threatening. What you gain in understanding, you spend in peace of mind. What happened to the real Murgo? Everything in the nightmare of Mensis orbits around Murgo. The crying, the servants, the attendants in their jester masks, the elaborate court. But Murgo is never visible. You hear the crying throughout the entire area, emanating from the ornate pram in the lunarium at the top of the loft. The pram is empty. The crying stops when you kill Murgo's wet nurse, but no body is ever produced. The 1/3 of umbilical cord dropped by the wet nurse describes Murgo as an infant great one, and confirms that Murgo's mother was Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen encountered in the Chalice dungeons. Murgo was never born into the waking world. The birth was stillborn, and the child exists only as a consciousness crying in a nightmare. Based on what the evidence points toward, the school of Mensis' ritual was designed to contact Murgo specifically, because Murgo, as a child of a great one carried by a Pthumerian queen, represented a unique bridge between humanity and the gods. If they could commune with Murgo, they could gain insight without the catastrophic physical transformations that contact with fully formed great ones seem to require. The plan failed. Murgo's consciousness is awake but infantile, surrounded by servants that exist only to comfort a crying baby that cannot be comforted in a nightmare that was built around its grief. The hunter's mark as a contract. The hunter rune, the carved mark found in various forms throughout the game, carried by hunters as a badge of their covenant with the dream, is described in item descriptions as a transcription of the inhuman language of the Great Ones, written by the runesmith Carol. The game introduces you to runes early and treats them as enhancements, mechanical bonuses to your abilities. But the hunter rune specifically is noted to be a pledge, an oath. When you enter the hunter's dream for the first time and are given the hunter's tools, you are not simply being equipped. You are entering into an agreement. The mark on your body is the language of the moon presence inscribed into your flesh. Every hunter who dreams is bound by this mark. Eileen the Crow and Jura of Old Yharnam both describe themselves as hunters who no longer dream, who have broken or severed their connection to the dream, whether through disgust or determination. The process of no longer dreaming is never explained mechanically, but the implication is that it involves a deliberate rejection of the mark, a refusal of the contract. You are left with the question, if entering the hunt is a contract, and the contract is with the moon presence, and the moon presence is using the hunt for its own purposes. What exactly did you agree to on that first night in Yharnam? The pungent beast scent in Gascoigne's clothes. The item description of Gascoigne's garb, the leather coat worn by Father Gascoigne and available for purchase after his defeat, contains a specific and disturbing detail. It notes that similar hunting garb was created in the workshop, but that this particular set is tainted by a pungent beastly stench that cannot be cleaned out. The description also notes that Father is a title used in a foreign land, that no such rank exists in the Healing Church, which confirms that Gascoigne came to Yharnam from elsewhere and brought his title with him. But the beastly stench is the lore detail that changes the nature of the entire encounter with him. It means the scourge was already in him before the night of the hunt depicted in the game. It had been building for long enough to soak into the fibers of his clothing permanently. The man you fight on the Great Bridge was not a hunter who had a bad night. He was a hunter who had been losing himself slowly for months or years, held back by the music box, by Viola, by his daughters, by everything that reminded him who he was before the blood took over. The night Viola forgot the music box was not the cause of Gascoigne's fall. It was the night his fall could no longer be hidden. What lies at the bottom of the Nightmare River? In the hunter's nightmare, there is a river of blood that flows through the first major open area. It is literally a river, not a stream or a pool, but a flowing watercourse made of blood, and it is deep enough to wade through. Following this river to its source leads you through some of the most harrowing parts of the DLC. Following it to its mouth, the direction the blood flows, eventually leads you to a cave at the bottom of the ravine. In that cave, surrounded by beasts in chains and the detritus of the nightmare, you find one of Jura's allies, the companion identified by the future press guide as carrying Jura's Gatling gun, the weapon described as belonging to the youngest of Jura's 3 companions. This hunter is in the nightmare blood-drunk and hostile, but positioned with his back to the beast rather than facing you. The positioning echoes Jura's own stance in Old Yharnam. This hunter is still, even in the depths of madness and the nightmare, trying to protect the beasts. He has been in this nightmare long enough to lose most of his reason, but the last thing to go, apparently, was his ideals. This is both the saddest and the most quietly heroic thing Bloodborne ever shows you. The unseen truth about the doll's emotion. The plain doll, as noted in her creation story, is a constructed being, fashioned from cloth and ceramic, and whatever arcane elements Gehrman poured into her to make her functional. She is not alive in any conventional sense. Gehrman built her, the moon presence animated her, and she has served as the dream's level-up mechanism and gentle presence ever since. But players who observe the doll carefully throughout a full playthrough notice things that suggest her inner life is more complex than her description allows. She appears in different locations around the hunter's dream, depending on circumstances. Sometimes at the gravestones, sometimes near the workshop, sometimes by the flowers. She reacts differently to different stages of the game. At certain insight thresholds, she speaks unprompted. What is most striking is the tear stone, an item dropped by the doll when you give her a tear blood gem and ask about her feelings. She weeps. The tear stone description reads, a stone that is said to be a crystallized tear of the plain doll. It is as if the doll is conscious of the fact that she is a doll and has been in a state of sorrow about this fact since the moment she was made. She is not mourning Maria. She's mourning herself. The awareness that she is a copy, a consolation, a beloved face wrapped around an absence. The crow's in Eileen's attire. The crow feather set worn by Eileen the crow carries a description noting that it was fashioned for hunters of hunters who prefer to isolate prey from others before dispatching them. The feathers are described as those of a messenger bird that carries secrets. The crow as a symbol of clandestine knowledge and unavoidable judgment. In European folk tradition, crows were associated with both death and wisdom, with the liminal space between life and whatever comes after. Eileen's entire design trades on this symbolism deliberately. She is the death that other hunters most need but most fear. The acknowledgement that the hunt does not spare hunters from its consequences, that becoming a beast is not a failure of willpower, but simply an endpoint on a road everyone who hunts is traveling. The crow hunter badge she drops in the event of her death states that the badge is proof of Eileen's victory over her mark in the Grand Cathedral. If her questline concludes with her success, the badge is her gift to you, a transfer of the covenant, the acknowledgement that the next hunter of hunters will be whoever survives. The crows are always watching from the rooftops. Whether they are Eileen's or something stranger, the game never entirely decides. Patches the spider. The recurring From Software character, Patches, appears in Bloodborne as well, hiding in the lecture building in his spider form. Because by the time the player reaches the lecture building, Patches has crawled far enough into the rabbit hole of Byrgenwerth's research that he has partially transformed into an kin creature, something between human and spider, still wearing his cloth hat and still wearing his particular brand of charming insincerity. He tricks you once in the game with a promise of treasure in the nightmare frontier, directs you to a ledge, and pushes you off. He blocks a passage in the lecture building. He is the same Patches he always is. Opportunistic, self-serving, genuinely entertaining. But his form in Bloodborne tells you something more than his usual characterization. He fell too far into the Byrgenwerth madness, chased the knowledge too greedily, and arrived somewhere he cannot entirely escape. The spider shape is not a costume. He did this to himself. He is still charming, still harmless by his own assessment, still wearing that hat. He is also permanently, partially, irreversibly transformed by the consequences of his own curiosity. He gets away with it, as he always does. The transformation just comes along for the ride. The note that was never meant to be read. In the abandoned old workshop, hidden in the decrepit building that mirrors the hunter's dream, you can find a note written in Gehrman's hand. It is addressed to the hunter, instructing them to go to the Chalice dungeons and seek out what rests there. This note was placed before you arrived, before this specific night began. Gehrman leaves notes for each hunter who cycles through the dream, pointing them toward the umbilical cord, toward the truth, toward the possibility of a different ending. The note is the evidence that Gehrman knows more than he says. He knows. The moon presence requires 3 umbilical cords to be overcome. He has watched hunters fail to find them for long enough to know where they are and what they cost. He wants you to find them. He wants you to eat them. He wants you to refuse his offer. The man in the wheelchair who tells you the night will come to an end and that all you need do is submit. That same man has been leaving breadcrumbs toward the one ending where you might escape both him and the entity that imprisoned him. Gehrman cannot free himself, but he keeps trying to free each new hunter who arrives. The shining coins and the messengers, the bath messengers, the small, reaching, eyeless figures who emerge from pools of water throughout the hunter's dream and Yharnam to sell you items and accept your echoes, are described in their lore as the servants of the Great Ones who tend to hunters during the hunt. They are not beasts. They are not hostile. They perform their function with quiet, inhuman reliability. The little ones, the smaller messengers that can be found wearing various accessories you attach to them, have a particular description, noting that they are drawn to hunters out of reverence and love. The messengers in Bloodborne occupy an interesting narrative space. They are the only creatures in the entire game who exist entirely in service of the hunter, who offer nothing but assistance and who ask for nothing in return except to be allowed to tend their function. Given the game's pervasive theme that every relationship in Yharnam is extractive, blood taken, faith exploited, love turned into obsession, the messenger's simple devotion stands as something almost radical. They are, in the truest sense, the only characters in Bloodborne who want nothing from you. The shadow of Yharnam's triple form, the shadow of Yharnam boss, the three-figure encounter guarding the path to Byrgenwerth, is not a random group of enemies. The three figures wear elaborate ceremonial clothing and carry distinct weapons: a curved sword, fire, and serpents. They are described in their design as guardians of Byrgenwerth's secrets, specifically of the path to the lake where Rom is hidden. But the serpents are the key lore detail. The shadows of Yharnam summon living serpents from their robes, command them, speak through the hissing. Snake parasites appear elsewhere in the Forbidden Woods. The enemies with snakes emerging from their heads, the cobra-hooded figures. The snake, in Bloodborne's visual language, is consistently associated with the deep knowledge of the Pthumerian civilization and with the specific kind of corruption that comes from proximity to the labyrinths. The Shadow of Yharnam are likely the last remnants of a Pthumerian bloodline. Not transformed beasts, but transformed people, priests of an older order, still performing their vigil at Byrgenwerth's gate, for reasons no one in the current age of the game's story fully understands anymore. They are the oldest guards in the game, watching a threshold that every living faction has forgotten the significance of. The Dark Beast Parl's loneliness. Dark Beast Parl is an optional boss encountered in Yahar'gul, the unseen village, a massive electrified beast made of something that looks like exposed skeleton wreathed in crackling lightning. Unlike most beasts, Parl does not simply charge and attack. It hesitates, it watches. When you kill Dark Beast Parl, you receive the Spark Hunter badge, an item that belonged to a healing church hunter, whose name is not given, but whose connection to bolt weaponry and lightning-type tools is significant. One reading of Parl is that this creature was once a human hunter who specialized in bolt weaponry, the very weapons its body now emits. Another reading draws from the forbidding chalice description, which mentions a beast made of lightning trapped in the labyrinth, implying Parl's origin may be Pthumerian rather than Yharnamite. The electrified skeleton is a detail that suggests a body burned from the inside by whatever process produced this particular beasthood, as if the lightning that once powered the hunter's tools eventually became the hunter's entire substance. The empty socket where the badge implies a hunter once existed is just a skeleton now, crackling with the remnants of an old craft. Mikolash's cage and his closed eyes. When you chase Mikolash through the nightmare and finally corner him, his face is hidden behind the Mensis cage. He does not remove it. He fights you behind it. The cage's description tells you it is both a communication device and a prison, an attempt to open the mind to the Great Ones that succeeded only in trapping those who wore it. Mikolash wears his cage not as a sacrifice like his followers, but as a choice. The deliberate insistence that the connection is worth maintaining even at the cost of everything else. His dialogue in the corner reveals that his desires in the nightmare are specifically about eyes. Having eyes, seeing more. perceiving the universe at a scale that human consciousness was never meant to access. His name, Mikolash, host of the nightmare, is not a condemnation. It is a description. He does not simply exist in the nightmare. He contains it. He invited it. He constructed it in collaboration with whatever Great One agreed to his request. The nightmare he hosts is the most elaborate and sustained act of scholarly hubris in the game. A man who built his prison from his own ambition and cannot tell the difference between his prison and his life's work. The celestial dial and what the clock strikes. When you defeat Lady Maria, she drops the celestial dial. A clock face with no clock attached, just the face, worn smooth by whatever time passes in the nightmare. Holding this item up before the astral clock tower causes its hands to begin moving for the first time. In what seems like eternity, the hands turn counterclockwise. They stop on the Great Lake rune. The rune, whose description reads that great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep and an augur of eldritch truth, and that overcoming this hindrance will lead you to what is yours. The water in that description is the ocean of the fishing hamlet. The clock's hands point to the village of fisher folk and the Great One's beached corpse on the shore. Maria has been guarding this door. The clock has been frozen because she froze it. Because the only thing the celestial dial can reveal when it moves is the path to the nightmare's most terrible secret, the atrocity that put her there. Defeating her does not destroy her mercy. It honors it. She held the clock still for as long as she was able. The counterclockwise movement, when it finally comes, feels like an exhale, the release of something that could not be contained forever, whatever the cost. The winter lanterns singing. In the nightmare of Menses, there are creatures called winter lanterns, humanoid beings with enormous translucent heads full of bobbing eyes, who cause instant, escalating frenzy simply by looking at you. Their frenzy aura is so powerful that standing in their sight for more than a few seconds is lethal. But if you can tolerate proximity without triggering their gaze, you will notice that winter lanterns are singing. They emit a soft, off-key melody as they wander. This melody has been identified by players as a version of the same lullaby connected to Murgo. A version of lullaby for Murgo hummed tunelessly by these terrible, eye-filled creatures. The winter lanterns were once human. Their heads were remade into something else through the same broad process that reshaped all of Mensis' subjects. Their skulls expanded to contain additional eyes, their minds replaced by whatever the nightmare filled the space with. They sing Murgo's lullaby because they serve Murgo's nightmare. They are the lullaby made physical, the song that was meant to soothe an infant Great One embodied in the most distressing possible form. Wandering the ramparts of the nightmare, still singing, still soothing, their frenzy aura doing to the human brain exactly what the song was intended to prevent. The scream at the end of Ludwig, the Holy Blade, is the first boss of the Hunter's nightmare and the namesake of Ludwig's Holy Blade. The weapon described as the trick weapon of the Healing Church Hunters, modelled on Ludwig's own blade to give the Church's hunters the means to fight terrifying beasts and things still worse. Ludwig founded the Healing Church Workshop, organised Yharnam's hunters into a disciplined force, and became the Church's great champion. By the time you fight him in the nightmare, he has been there long enough to become monstrous, an enormous beast, his lower body consumed and replaced with something equine and wrong, his upper half still reaching with recognisable arms and hands. When his health reaches a certain threshold, something extraordinary happens. The Holy Moonlight Sword appears in the arena, an arcane sword with a description noting it was discovered long ago by Ludwig himself, that it channels the abyssal cosmos, and that whatever guidance it has to offer seems to be of a very private and elusive sort. Ludwig sees it, he grasps it, and something in him that had been lost finds its way back. The second phase of the fight is Ludwig remembering, through a sword, who he was. After you defeat him, his severed head remains in the arena. If you wear church-related attire and speak to him, he will ask whether his church hunters are the honorable Spartans he hoped they would be. If you answer yes, he thanks you for letting him know that he did not suffer for nothing, and quietly dies. The nightmare gave him back his awareness specifically so that he could die knowing. The sword that spoke to him in the Chalice dungeons, the one that made him a hero, was also the thing that gave him a death worth having. The Abandoned Workshop doll set's second story. The doll set available in the Abandoned Old Workshop carries a description, a detail easily missed, because most players find the doll set by purchasing it from the Bath Messengers after acquiring enough insight. But finding it in the workshop itself, in the crumbling building that predates the hunter's dream, gives the item a different weight. The set describes a dress worn by a doll in an abandoned workshop, left there to await someone who would never return. Gehrman left the dream at some point, or the workshop left Gehrman, as the dream took its form and the original workshop decayed into ruin. The doll was already there when the workshop was abandoned. She was always there. In the hunter's dream, she is alive and animated and serves a purpose. In the abandoned old workshop, the physical echo of the place where she was made, she is described as having been left. The gap between those two states, animated and left, is the entire history of Gehrman's grief. He made her to fill a space that could not be filled. He animated her through a contract that consumed his freedom. And then he grew indifferent, because she could wear the face but not carry the soul. And the indifference is perhaps the most human thing about him. The admission that not even magic can replace what was actually lost. The two umbilical cords. You almost miss. Many players who reached the end of Bloodborne discovered too late that they were missing the umbilical cords required to fight the moon presence, because 3 of the 4 available cords require actions that are easily skipped or permanently missable. The cord from the abandoned old workshop requires navigating a treacherous descent through the scaffolding of the Healing Church workshop tower. A drop-down rope platforms above a lethal fall that most players simply miss entirely. The cord from Ariana requires her to survive long enough to give birth, which means both keeping her alive in the chapel and avoiding Adela's jealousy. The cord from the imposter Yosefka requires entering her clinic from a back entrance during the blood moon and killing her before she disappears, accepting that you are killing a pregnant woman who may be undergoing the same transformation she inflicted on others. The 4th cord, from Murgo's wet nurse, is mandatory. You fight the wet nurse to complete the main game. These 4 cords, distributed across the most easily missed side quests and most morally confrontational choices in the game, form a barrier not just mechanically, but philosophically. The true ending of Bloodborne requires you to have engaged fully with its human stories, to have noticed the details and made the difficult choices and followed the tragedy to its source. The game does not hand you liberation. It hides it in the parts of Yharnam most people stop looking at. What the plain doll does when you're gone. Between visits to the hunter's dream, if you observe the plain doll carefully, she is not static. She moves between several locations around the dream's small garden and workshop. She can be found near the graves in the back. Near the one grave in the dream that corresponds to the grave in the abandoned old workshop. she can be found near the flowers. She can be found sitting quietly on the workshop steps. The game does not call attention to this. She does not make it a conversation topic. She moves quietly and independently, maintaining her own rhythm that has nothing to do with the hunter's schedule or needs. One reading is that the doll is simply a more complex program than she appears, that the moon presence animated her with just enough internal life to seem real. Another reading, more compelling and more disturbing, is that the doll is fully conscious, has been conscious since the moment Gehrman made her, and has spent every quiet moment between hunters mourning the only life she can see clearly, the one she was built to imitate but can never live. She moves to the graves when no one is watching. She stands over them. She goes back to the workshop before anyone returns. The Yahargul Bell. Women's purpose. Among the most haunting environmental details in the post-blood moon, Yahargul is the distribution of bell-ringing women throughout the village. These women in robes stand at specific locations and ring bells that summon adversarial phantom hunters from other worlds, a mechanic that increases the difficulty by introducing unpredictable human-level enemies into an already dangerous area. But what is the narrative explanation for their presence here? Based on everything surrounding the School of Mensis and the kidnapping of Yharnam's citizens, the most coherent reading is that these women were taken to Yahargul for use in the ritual, and the function they now serve is the function they were assigned: to maintain the boundary between the waking world and the nightmare, to summon hunters from adjacent dreams, to keep the machine of Mensis's grand ritual running even after the scholars who designed it have long since lost their minds. They do not appear to be beasts. They appear to be people, or close to people, performing a task they were given and cannot escape. The bell in their hands is the only thing they still control. They ring it over and over. The hunters they summon pour out of the air. This is what the School of Mensis called research, the crow's silent judgment of the hunt. One of the most significant environmental storytelling details in Bloodborne is something almost invisible: the crows. Dead crows, strung up by their feet, or found lying in specific places throughout Yharnam, mark locations associated with Eileen's hunt. The crow feather set description tells you that crows were the symbol chosen by the hunters of hunters, specifically because of the crow's association with finality and secrets. Where crows appear in Bloodborne, something has ended or is about to end. The tomb where Viola's body is found has crows circling it. Old Yharnam, with its sealed gate and its note warning hunters away, is watched from above by crows. The Grand Cathedral, where Eileen's final mark is hunted, has them as well. They are not placed randomly. Eileen's predecessors in the Covenant spent enough time in enough dark places that the mark of their passing became synonymous with the bird. You can track Eileen's movements through a playthrough almost entirely by where the crows cluster. The hunter of hunters chose not to leave bloodstains or warnings, but to let the bird speak for them. A quiet, natural marking system that requires the kind of attention to the world that the hunt itself is supposed to teach you. Mikolash's Loran Prayer. Mikolash's full prayer in the boss encounter, Kos, or some say Kosum, is a direct attempt at contact with the Great One whose death at the fishing hamlet started the nightmare. But the name Kosum is not simply a variant pronunciation. Item descriptions in the Chalice dungeons reference the Loran civilization, which worshipped beings connected to the Great Ones and burned itself out in the attempt. And the linguistic root, Kosum, appears in the Loran context in ways that suggest a separate tradition of worship for this particular entity, older than Byrgenwerth. older than the fishing hamlet expedition, traceable to civilizations that were already ruins by the time Werlem's scholars first descended into the labyrinths. Micolash is not just praying to Kos, he is using a Lauran name for Kos, drawing on a religious vocabulary so old that most of Yharnam's institutions have no record of it. The fact that he knows this name at all is evidence of how deep the School of Mensis went in its research. They did not just study what Byrgenwerth found, they went back further, to the civilizations that preceded even the Chalice Dungeon explorers, and found the same beings worshipped under older names. The nightmare was built, in part, from that research. The Eye Rune's true inheritance, the Eye Rune, described as a transcription of the Great One Ebrietus's voice by the runesmith Caril, is dropped by Master Willem when killed. This is significant because it means that the man who founded Byrgenwerth, who spent his career studying the Great Ones and attempting to cultivate eyes in the brains of his scholars and subjects, ended his days carrying the voice of Ebrietas, written on his person. He had made contact, not in the catastrophic, mind-destroying way that Micolash or the School of Mensis attempted, but in some way that left him with a rune rather than a ruined mind. The tube-like growths on Willem's back, visible when you approach him in his chair overlooking the lake, are the same type of growth seen on Ebrietas herself, a physical transformation that mirrors the Great One he spent his life studying. Willem, at the end of his days, is partway through the same transformation that took his former student Lawrence in an entirely different direction. He bleeds shimmering blood, the same blood as Rom, the scholar who transcended under his tutelage. The old man in the chair at Byrgenwerth is not merely a witness to the history, he is one of its most extreme outcomes. The researcher who came so close to the truth that the truth started growing through his skin. The Snatcher's confession. The Snatcher enemies in central Yharnam. The large hooded figures who ambush hunters and drag them to the cells of Yahar'gul are one of the game's early indications that not everything sinister in Yharnam is the Beast Plague's fault. These are organized, intentional actors working on behalf of the School of Mensis, gathering bodies for the ritual. The Mensis scholar set, worn by the robed scholars of Yahar'gul, describes it as the uniform of those who devoted themselves to Mensis's vision of ascending beyond humanity through contact with the Great Ones. But the Snatchers themselves carry no set, are never described as scholars, and operate with a mechanical efficiency that suggests they were not volunteers. One reading is that the Snatchers are Yahar'gul residents who were transformed into servants, their own neighbors pressed into the service of rounding up more neighbors. Another reading, based on their body shape and lack of item descriptions, is that they are something the school created specifically for the task of procurement. Either reading is disturbing. Either a community was converted into its own harvester, or an institution built specialized tools for kidnapping. The cells of Yahar'gul hold whoever they caught. The Snatchers are still working. The two great bridges of Yharnam. Central Yharnam has two great stone bridges spanning the central ravine. The first is where you fight Father Gascoigne, in the Tomb of Eden. Below the bridge's arch, with corpses on the ground and fog rolling in from the rooftops. The second, the one spanning toward Old Yharnam, is where the cleric beast screams. These two bridges function as a paired introduction to what Yharnam is. The first bridge gives you a human tragedy, a man who loved his family and lost himself. The second gives you an institutional one, a member of the church who trusted the church's blood and became the thing the church created. Every person who crosses these bridges in the hunt walks between those two possible stories. the intimate human disaster, and the systemic religious catastrophe. They are structurally parallel, visually similar, and separated by perhaps 50 yards of stone. The architects of Yharnam almost certainly did not design them as a metaphor. FromSoft placed them that way deliberately, as the game's first statement about the two scales on which Bloodborne's tragedy operates: the personal and the political. You fight Gascoigne and understand what the hunt costs a family. You see the cleric beast and understand what the church costs a civilization. The Forbidden Woods' terrible cattle. In the Forbidden Woods, accessible after defeating Vicar Amelia and entering the Great Hall, the main path runs through a sprawling forest filled with snake-parasited enemies and ambush positions. But a secondary path, followed carefully, leads to a series of livestock pens hidden in the wood's deepest section. In these pens are large-scale snake beasts, the snakeball enemies, and the massive snake clusters found throughout this area. Item descriptions on snake parasites note that the parasites are native to the fishing hamlet region and spread through contact. Their presence in the Forbidden Woods, in what appear to be purposeful pens rather than natural habitation, implies that someone was farming them, harvesting the snake parasites, the same organisms that sustained the fishing hamlet's people and were carried by Koss's corpse, and keeping them for some purpose in this enclosed forest location. The Forbidden Woods were sealed to keep people from reaching Bergenwerth, but the sealing may have also been meant to contain whatever experiment was being conducted in those pens, far from the church's public face, in an area officially off-limits to ordinary citizens. Vicar Amelia's golden appearance. Vicar Amelia is the boss of the Grand Cathedral, the woman who led the Healing Church's most sacred institution, the Vicar, the highest human-facing authority of the entire organization. And she is, by the time you meet her, a massive golden beast hunched over the altar of the Grand Cathedral, clutching a pendant and praying. She is praying. When you first enter the cathedral, if your insight is high enough, you hear her speaking. A fragmented prayer about forbearance, about the blood, about insight and fear. She is not yet fully transformed. She is holding on in the most public and sacred space in Yharnam, trying to complete her prayer before the beast in her body completes her transformation. The gold pendant she clutches carries a description revealing its true weight. It is passed down among the vicars who head the Healing Church as a reminder of the cautionary adage, the same adage that opens the gates of Bergenwerth. It is not a comfort. It is a warning, carried by every vicar, worn around the neck of the institution's highest authority. Amelia held the warning in her hands as she transformed. She got too close to the blood, as all church leadership eventually does, and began to transform in her cathedral, before her altar, mid-prayer. The tragedy is not simply that she became a beast. It is that you see the moment of it. You see her praying for mercy at the exact moment the mercy runs out. Her gold fur is the most beautiful and terrible thing in the Grand Cathedral. What the Healing Church actually worshipped. The Healing Church's public theology was a form of blood ministration. Healing through the infusion of special blood, framed in quasi-religious terms as a gift from the Great Ones. But the internal hierarchy of the church tells a different story. The choir occupied the upper cathedral ward. Their role, according to the Great Eyes Chalice description, was to have audience with Ebrietas, to maintain direct contact with the Great One who had been discovered below the Grand Cathedral. The church, at its highest levels, was not a faith organization. It was a research organization maintaining a working relationship with an entity it could not fully understand, and that it simultaneously harvested for blood. The old blood distributed to pilgrims came in part from Ebritas, the abandoned Great One housed in the church's basement, whose blood the church's most devout members were routinely exposed to. The choir's blindfolds are inherited from Willem's Burgenwerth, but where Willem's was philosophical, cover your eyes, cultivate inner sight, the choir's is practical. What they saw when they communed with Ebrietas was too much for unprotected human perception. The holiest members of the healing church went blind in the service of their research. The blood the church gave to the sick was extracted from a god in their basement. The blood dreg and what it represents. The blood dreg item, the covenant currency of the Cainhurst Vilebloods, dropped by hunters killed while the Vileblood Oath rune is equipped, has a description so dense with implication that it essentially summarizes the Vileblood ideology in a single paragraph. Blood dregs are described as the concentrated essence of hunter's blood, the impure remains of a violent life, offered to Queen Annalise so that she may one day be with child. The Queen of the Vilebloods is not merely collecting trophies of conquest. She is attempting to conceive. The blood of dead hunters, purified through their violence and concentrated into dregs, is an offering toward a pregnancy. The Vilebloods believe, or Annalise believes, that by accumulating enough of this particular blood, a womb can be prepared for a child of the cosmos. This aligns with every other pregnancy narrative in Bloodborne. The Great Ones lose their children and woo their surrogates through blood. Annalise, deathless and patient at the top of her ruined castle, is performing the longest and most elaborate version of this same ritual, collecting hunter by hunter, dreg by dreg, century by century, trying to invite the impossible. The connection between Uden and the pregnancies. Erden is the formless Great One whose name is attached to the tomb, the chapel, and the runes that replenish quicksilver bullets. The formless Erden rune's description notes that it is thought to be a transcription of Erden's very voice, that the soundless words of the formless one ripple in the blood, that each drop of blood carries some consciousness of the formless god. Every blood ministration in Yharnam is, one reading suggests, an infusion of a trace of Uden. Every person who received the church's blood healing carries a fragment of a formless god's voice in their veins. The note in Bergenwerth about wombs being blessed when the Great Ones descend connects to Uden specifically through the blood. If Uden exists as sound in blood, then the womb blessed when the Great Ones descend may not be blessed by any god's direct action, but simply by the accumulation of enough blood-carried resonance to initiate something. Ariana, Vileblood descendant with unusual blood, becomes pregnant with the Great One's child near the end of the game. The imposter, Iosefka, who received the heaviest concentration of transformed blood in the game, also becomes pregnant. The pattern is not random. The blood is not just medicine. It is invitation. The hunter's nightmare. As a lesson, at a deeper level than the mechanics and the enemies, the hunter's nightmare in the old Hunters DLC is a teaching tool. The nightmare was not created to punish the hunters who participated in the fishing hamlet massacre. It was created because Koss's curse made it impossible for them to escape the consequences of what they did. The nightmare preserves the truth. Every hunter who ended up there is living inside the record of the worst thing they ever did. The fishing hamlet is at the top. The research, the atrocities, the beach where Koss's corpse still lies. It is all there perfectly preserved in nightmare amber. The hunters in the nightmare, Henrik, Ludwig, Jura's companion, the nameless hunters throughout, are not being tortured by demons. They are being held in the space between what they did and what they might have been. This is what Bloodborne's curse lore ultimately describes. Not punishment as external imposition, but consequence as permanent context. The hunters who burned Yharnam are trapped in old Yharnam. The hunters who came to the fishing hamlet are trapped above the hamlet. The nightmare mirrors the sin precisely. You walk through history when you walk through the hunter's nightmare, and the history does not forgive, and the history does not lie. The clue in the imposter's pregnancy. When you reach the imposter, Yosefka, during the blood moon, entering from the back route through the forbidden woods rather than her front door, you find her in the upper level of the clinic, kneeling on the floor, murmuring to herself about having been chosen, about something growing inside her. If you attack her at this point and kill her, she drops a 1/3 of umbilical cord. The imposter replaced the real Yosefka, transformed the real woman into a celestial mob, used the clinic as a transformation facility, and at some point became pregnant with a Great One's child. The implication, given the pattern established by Ariana and the Bergenwerth note, is that the imposter's extended exposure to transformed subjects, to celestial blood, to the specific arcane environment she created in the clinic, crossed a threshold similar to the one the blood moon brought to Ariana. She wanted to be chosen. She spent the night performing experiments aimed at producing higher beings. The result was that she became one of the women the game flags as chosen. Pregnant, with something she can barely articulate, kneeling on the floor of the clinic she stole, in the language of someone who got exactly what she was reaching for and cannot begin to understand it. The celestial child's unknowing gift. The creature that Ariana gives birth to in the aqueduct between the tomb of Eden and the cathedral ward lamps. The small, crawling infant Great One that you can hear whimpering softly before you enter the passage, drops a 1/3 of umbilical cord when killed. This means that killing the child grants you a key component of the game's transcendence ending. It is the clearest example of Bloodborne forcing you to reckon with what the lore costs. To free yourself from the dream, to become a Great One yourself, you must kill a child. The child that Ariana suffered to carry, the child that was inflicted on her by cosmic forces she neither chose nor understood, the child she can be heard mourning in quiet exhaustion nearby. That child is one of the 3 keys to your personal liberation. Bloodborne makes no attempt to soften this. Killing it sends Ariana into shock. She lies on the floor of the aqueduct in a state of unresponsive grief. The umbilical cord sits in your inventory, described as a great relic with the capacity to grant eyes on the inside. Every cord in the game has a human story behind it. Gehrman's grief, Ariana's suffering, the imposter's ambition, the nightmare of Mensis. The transcendence ending of Bloodborne is purchased entirely with other people's pain. The sealed church in Upper Cathedral Ward. The Upper Cathedral Ward requires a specific key found in the Healing Church workshop to access. This key, the Upper Cathedral key, has a description noting that the upper echelons of the Healing Church are restricted to the few. The implication is not that the Upper Cathedral Ward is sacred, but that it is secret. The choir's experiments with ebrietas were never meant to be seen by the lay people who knelt in the Grand Cathedral below. The architecture of the Healing Church is a hierarchy of concealment. The public face in the Grand Cathedral with its vicar and its blood chalice and its sermons, and above it, hidden behind a locked door on a staircase most parishioners never ascended, the actual work of the institution. The celestial emissary, the living failures, Ebrietas herself. All of this was occurring directly above where ordinary citizens came to be healed and blessed. The height of the architecture is the height of the secret. The Healing Church built its most profound violations at the literal top of the building, as if the elevation itself was a kind of protection, as if no one would think to look up. The moonlight and the holy sword. Ludwig's holy moonlight sword carries a description among the most evocative in the game. An arcane sword discovered long ago by Ludwig that when blue moonlight dances around it and it channels the abyssal cosmos, its great blade will hurl a shadowy light wave. The description adds that the holy moonlight sword is synonymous with Ludwig, the holy blade, but that few have ever set eyes on the great blade. And whatever guidance it offers seems to be of a very private, elusive sort. The sword spoke to Ludwig when he found it in the Chalice dungeons. He interpreted it as divine guidance, and from that vision he created the Guidance Carol rune. The sword's connection to the moon, to the cosmos, to the thin thread of light that Ludwig's second phase dialogue calls his true mentor. These are the markers of what made him a great hunter before the nightmare consumed him. The Moonlight Sword recurs throughout From Software's games as a symbol of something pure in the midst of darkness. In Bloodborne, it is not inherited power or magic. It is the crystallized memory of a man who believed in something genuinely, fighting in a world that consumed that belief entirely. When Ludwig sees it glinting in the nightmare and grasps it, the monster becomes a knight again, even if only for the duration of a boss fight, even if only to ask at the end whether it meant anything. The unseen architecture of the Great Ones, hidden throughout Bloodborne's levels, visible only at certain inside levels or from certain angles, are architectural features that do not belong to any human building tradition. The amygdalae cling to structures. Strange organic passages exist within the walls of the research hall. The lecture building, accessible through a door in Yahar'gul, exists in its own pocket of dimensional space entirely, neither connected to the waking world nor fully part of any nightmare. Its architecture resembles a university lecture hall, but its exits open onto different nightmares depending on which floor you're on. Item descriptions related to the lecture building note that the building was connected to Bergenwerth in its function, but that its spatial relationship to the physical world had become ambiguous, that it existed in the space between the waking world and the nightmare, accessible from both but belonging to neither. The building itself is an architectural consequence of too much contact with the Great Ones, a space that has been partially dreamed, whose walls are solid to the touch, but whose geometry refuses ordinary logic. You can enter it from Yahar'gul. You can exit it into either the Nightmare Frontier or the Nightmare of Mensis. The building knows more than it should about the shape of the cosmos. The pattern of forgotten masters. Bloodborne's lore is structured around a recurring pattern that appears at every scale of the story. A teacher has a vision. A student takes the vision further than the teacher intended, and the student's excess creates catastrophe. Willem had a vision about gaining eyes. Lawrence took that vision and built a blood-distributing church. The church created the choir, who took the vision further and began experimenting on patients. The School of Menses took the vision further still and began performing rituals that tore holes in the fabric of the waking world. Gehrman had a vision about protecting hunters through a dream. The Moon Presence took that vision and turned it into a prison. Maria trained under Gehrman and took his techniques to the fishing hamlet, where they were applied to people who never consented to be part of any experiment. In every case, the origin of the disaster is someone's genuine, earnest, well-intentioned intellectual reaching. And the disaster is what happens when the reach extends past the ability to evaluate consequences. the most terrifying aspect of Bloodborne's lore is not the Great Ones or the beasts. It is the unbroken chain of people who thought they were the ones who would finally get the answer right, and were wrong in new and spectacular ways each time. The Lumen Flower's secret. Throughout the Hunter's Dream and the Astral Clock Tower, a specific flower appears with unusual frequency. The Lumen Flower, a tall bloom with glowing bioluminescent properties that appear throughout the game's most dream-adjacent spaces. Lady Maria is described as having a fondness for lumen flowers. The doll set, modelled on Maria's appearance, incorporates lumen flower imagery in its embroidery. The Lumenwood Garden in the Research Hall, the final stage of the choir's patient ascension program, is named for these same flowers. The connection between the flowers and transformation, between their bioluminescence and the illuminated quality of the fully ascended choir members, between their bloom in the dream and their presence in a nightmare garden of incomplete transcendence, is one of Bloodborne's quieter symbolic threads. The lumen flower is beautiful, and it grows in the places where the boundary between human and Great One is thinnest. Maria liked them. The doll wears their likeness. The patients of the research hall were left to bloom or fail in a garden of them. Whatever the lumen flower means in Bloodborne's symbolic vocabulary, it is the nearest thing the game offers to a visual language for the hope of transcendence. The light that comes just before you lose yourself entirely. The blood echoes of the dead. Blood echoes, the currency of Bloodborne, the substance you collect from every killed enemy and lose when you die, are described in their item description as the concentrated remnants of a being's life essence left behind when they die. You are collecting the echoes of lives. Every blood echo you spend at the doll to level your character is the remnant of a person or creature that existed before you ended them. The economy of Bloodborne runs entirely on death. The character growth system is built on accumulation of the dead. This is not incidental to the game's themes. The hunt is sustained by blood, and blood is sustained by violence, and violence produces the echoes that fund the next round of violence. When you die and your echoes remain glowing on the ground where you fell, you are seeing your own life essence, briefly separated from your body, waiting. The messengers bring you back to the dream. The echoes wait for your return, or are consumed by whatever killed you. The cycle of the hunt is visible in this mechanic at the most granular level. Die, return, recover what was lost, spend it to become stronger, die again. The hunt does not end because the cycle does not end. The echoes just keep accumulating. The chapel dweller's unanswered prayer. In Erden Chapel, the chapel dweller, a gaunt, shaking figure who huddles in the corner near the Erden Chapel lamp, is the first NPC you encounter in the game who has reached the safety of the chapel on his own. He whispers to you about the hunt, about the night, about the need to find somewhere safe. He is terrified. He is also the guardian of the chapel in his own way. When survivors arrive, he acknowledges them, makes space, persists in his own small, frightened existence. His attire and design suggest a long-time Yarnamite, someone who has lived through hunts before and knows how to survive them. But he is not well. He shakes constantly. His dialogue gets progressively more fragmented as the night wears on and the blood moon descends. He does not transform. He does not attack you. He simply endures, shaking in his corner, outlasting horror through stubbornness rather than strength. Of all the characters who survive or fail to survive Bloodborne's night, the chapel dweller is the one whose story is entirely about ordinary human fear. Not beast hunger, not cosmic ambition, not betrayal or obsession. just a man who knew where the chapel was and made it there and stayed very, very still. The third ending and what you become. When you consume 3 of the 4 available umbilical cords and refuse Gehrman's offer and defeat both Gehrman and the moon presence, a cutscene plays showing your character curling inward, shrinking, transforming. You become an infant Great One, a tiny dark shape cradled by the plain doll in the hunter's dream as the sun rises over the ruined garden. The doll holds you with an expression that might be called tenderness, though tenderness implies warmth, and the doll is made of neither. She says that a new journey begins, that new hunters will come. She pushes you, in your new infantile form, back toward the workshop in a wheelchair, the same wheelchair that imprisoned Gehrman. You have taken his place. You have not escaped. You have been promoted. The moon presence that imprisoned Gehrman is gone. You destroyed it, but the structure of the dream remains. The cycle continues. The new Great One at its center is you. This ending, called childhood's beginning, is not the happy ending its promotional framing might suggest. It is the confirmation that the only way out of the hunt is to become the thing that sustains the hunt. The doll smiles. She has tended this garden before. She will tend it again. How Carol heard the Great Ones. The runesmith Carol is mentioned in item descriptions, but never encountered as an NPC, a scholar from Byrgenwerth, who discovered a method of transcribing the language of the Great Ones into physical marks. The Carol runes, which you inscribe into your own body to gain passive abilities, are the results of this scholarship. The Rune Workshop Tool's description states that runesmith Carol, student of Byrgenwerth, transcribed the inhuman utterings of the Great Ones into what are now called Carol runes. The Eye rune, the Moon rune, the Hunter rune. All of them are sounds turned into marks. The inhuman language of cosmic entities compressed into glyphs small enough to engrave on human flesh. Carol's methodology was different from every other Byrgenwerth researcher. Rather than attempting direct contact through rituals or bodily modification, Carol listened. Just listened, and wrote down what was heard. The result was a technology of inscription rather than a transformation, a way of borrowing the power of the Great Ones without attempting to become them. The Rune Workshop tool also notes that Master Willem would have been proud of Carol's runes, as they do not rely upon blood in any measure. Whether Carol survived the process of listening to things that unmade everyone else who tried to understand them, the game does not say. The runes remain, they work. The listener left behind the only system in Bloodborne that does not eventually destroy its user. The imposter at the gate. One of the most frequently overlooked lore details in Bloodborne concerns the Byrgenwerth Gate Watchman, a figure described in one of the game's in-world notes as guarding the gate to Byrgenwerth with a password, the sacred adage of the Grand Cathedral. This means that at some point, the path to Byrgenwerth was protected not by a locked gate, but by a code word known only to members of the Healing Church. The fact that the sacred adage, the password, was of the Grand Cathedral rather than of Byrgenwerth itself tells you the power dynamic. The Church controlled access to the institution that predated and philosophically underpinned the Church. The scholars of Byrgenwerth, in their later days, were gated behind a password set by their institutional successors. Master Willem, presumably, accepted this arrangement, or was too diminished to refuse it. The note also implies that at some point the watchman himself went mad. The same note references a watcher who guards the gate and has gone insane from proximity to the dungeon's truth. The password is still being kept by a gatekeeper who no longer understands what they are keeping, standing guard at a door to a place the church is pretending does not exist. The Tomb of Udin's 3 Tragedies. The Tomb of Udin. The sunken courtyard beneath the Tomb of Udin lamp in central Yharnam is a relatively small area that manages to contain 3 separate tragedies in its geography. Gascoigne is here, hacking at corpses, already past the point of return. Viola's body is on the roof above him, marked by her red jeweled brooch, and if you follow Eileen's quest line, Henrik will later appear at the lamp here, blood-addled and ready to kill you on sight. The tomb itself, the formal tomb associated with the formless god Odin, is interesting in the context of these deaths. Odin has no form. Odin exists only as resonance in blood. The location named for the formless god is where Yharnam's blood-drunk hunters most visibly lose themselves, where the victims of blood hunger accumulate, where the cycle of the hunt becomes most personal. 3 generations of a single extended family die connected to this location. Gascoigne here, Viola on the roof above him, and Henrik at its lamp. The Tomb of Udin is neither a monument nor a warning. It is a drain, and everything that succumbs to the blood flows through it eventually. What happens to every survivor? Bloodborne survivor, NPCs, the humans who can be escorted to Udin Chapel or Iosefka's clinic for their theoretical safety, do not fare well. The lonely old woman dies when the man-eater boar finds her in the chapel. Ariana suffers her unwanted pregnancy and falls into shock. Adela either murders Ariana or survives to vanish entirely. The despondent man in the chapel descends into fragmented ramblings and may eventually attack you. Narrow-minded Henry, if sent to the chapel, is found dead. The survivors who go to Iosefka's clinic are transformed into celestial mobs and then killed by the imposter. Only the chapel dweller truly endures, shaking and frightened but alive through the end of the blood moon, still in his corner, still present when you return. The game offers you the illusion of saving people repeatedly and then removes those people quietly, without ceremony, as if the hunt does not permit rescue as a lasting state. The chapel is not a safe place. It is a waiting room. What everyone in Bloodborne is waiting for: healing, safety, transcendence, dawn. The game denies to almost all of them. The only people who achieve any version of the thing they wanted are the ones who came not to be saved, but to understand. The one road out, the Yharnam sunrise ending, achieved by accepting Gehrman's offer, is the simplest and in many ways the most honest conclusion Bloodborne offers. You kneel. Gehrman rises from his wheelchair, takes up the burial blade, and beheads you. You wake in Yharnam as the sun rises, kneeling in an alley, alive and free. The credits roll without commentary. This ending is not failure. It is the intended exit, the one Gehrman designed and has been offering to every hunter for as long as the dream has existed. The sun rises. It is morning. The hunt is over for you, personally, even as it continues for everyone else. The doll bids you farewell in the dream before the execution. The hunter's going home. She says it with the same gentle flatness with which she says everything, but the words matter. Going home. The hunter came from somewhere. There is somewhere to return to. The dream will continue. Other hunters will come. The night will go on. But for this one hunter, on this one night, the blood has been paid and the contract fulfilled, and the sun is coming up, and there is a road out after all. Through the old man in the wheelchair and his terrible mercy and the garden that is burning behind you as you finally wake. The ritual circle in Yahar'gul. In Yahar'gul, the unseen village, The architecture is built around a specific ritual purpose. The village does not merely house the school of Mensis. It was redesigned around the ritual to beckon the blood moon. The bell ringers, the kidnapped citizens in cells, the specific placement of the forbidden forest access, the lecture building connections. All of it was positioned in relation to a ritual whose center is the nightmare of Mensis above. The item description for the Mensis cage notes that the one who wears it offers their own brain to contact a great one's brain. Yahar'gul is the physical ritual circle for this contact. A village converted into a transmission device populated with instruments human and architectural alike, aimed at the sky where Murgo's nightmare rests. The village was not always unseen. The name implies it was hidden deliberately, sealed away from public knowledge once the school began its work. The Healing Church knew Yahar'gul existed and chose not to acknowledge it publicly, which means they knew what was happening there and permitted it, or at least chose not to stop it, because the research served the church's broader interest in making contact with the Great Ones. The night the church burned the bridge, a lore note found in the area approaching Old Yharnam, near the sealed gate that blocks entry into the burned district, reads, "When the hunt began, the Healing Church left us, blocking the great bridge to Cathedral Ward, as Old Yharnam burned to the ground that moonlit night. This note is written from the perspective of someone who was in Old Yharnam when the burning happened." It describes abandonment. The church withdrawing behind its great bridge, sealing the gate, and leaving the district to burn while hunters finished the cleansing. The people of Old Yharnam, the ones who were not yet fully transformed, the ones who might have been saved with intervention, were sealed inside with the fire and the beasts. The church made a strategic decision to cut them off. Jura stayed because he could not leave, or would not. His companions stayed. The note's author, whoever they were, also stayed, or died, and the note remained. The Healing Church's public narrative frames the burning of Old Yharnam as a regrettable necessity. This note suggests it was a choice made quickly and cleanly by people who had somewhere else to go and went there. The hidden graves of the dream. In the hunter's dream, visible from the workshop's window and accessible through the back door of the building, there are 4 graves marked by simple stone markers in the garden. The graves correspond to characters associated with the dream's history. German's long-dead apprentice, whose old hunter bone is found near the corresponding grave in the abandoned old workshop, and other figures whose specific identities are unmarked, but whose presence in the dream's garden suggests they were hunters who became closely enough connected to the dream to be commemorated within it. The doll visits these graves. German, in his more lucid moments, acknowledges their existence. The dream has a cemetery. The dream is old enough and intimate enough to have accumulated its dead, to have found ways to remember them. This detail is one of the most human things about the hunter's dream, which otherwise exists to serve a function. The graves exist not to serve the hunt, but simply because some things deserve to be remembered, even in an artificial space constructed by a grieving man and a cosmic predator, even in a dream that burns at the end. The truth about why you were called. The opening of Bloodborne presents the player as a pilgrim who came to Yharnam specifically seeking the blood for healing. A person with some unspecified illness who underwent a blood transfusion in the Yosefka's clinic in the game's pre-dawn prologue. This is the accepted cover story for the player character's presence in Yharnam. But the third umbilical cord description from the abandoned old workshop says that the dream itself beckoned the hunters, that the moon presence reached out and called them. The hunter did not choose Yharnam at random. The hunter was, on some level, invited. The blood ministration that occurs at the game's start is not simply a medical procedure. It is initiation. The mark is placed. The contract is made. The moon presence needed a new hunter, needed someone who might, if properly guided, end both the nightmare and Gehrman's imprisonment, and take the dream forward into a new configuration. You were not a patient who wandered into a dangerous city. You were a candidate, tested from the moment the blood entered your veins, guided by Gehrman's breadcrumbs and the moon presence's architecture toward an outcome that neither of them could fully predict, but that the dream had been building toward for longer than anyone can account for. The night was not happening to you. It was designed for you. The final mercy of the burial blade, Gehrman's weapon, the burial blade, carries a description noting that it was a weapon fashioned by the first hunter himself. A curved blade whose arc mimics the scythe used by hunters of the dream, suggesting its purpose is not simply to kill, but to reap, in the old agricultural and metaphorical sense, to harvest what has grown past its season, to clear the field for what comes next. When Gehrman uses the burial blade on hunters who accept his offer, the execution is precisely that, a harvesting. The hunter who kneels before him is not being punished or consumed. They are being released. The blade's scythe form is the formal implement of mercy in the hunt, the tool of a man who has watched hundreds of hunters walk through his dream and has developed, over whatever uncountable span of time has passed, something he cannot quite call love for them, but cannot call anything lesser without losing the word. He wants to free you. He wants to free himself. The blade he crafted for the hunt has become, in his hands, the only instrument of genuine kindness that the dream's terrible machinery permits. Gehrman tends the dream. Gehrman tends the hunters. And at the end of the night, Gehrman, if you let him, sets them free. The ashen blood that started everything. Before the beast scourge became the all-consuming catastrophe you navigate through central Yharnam and the cathedral ward, there was something else. A disease called ashen blood that struck the original Yharnam settlement first. The antidote item description, found scattered throughout the game, describes ashen blood as a baffling illness that preceded the beast scourge, a slow poisoning of the blood that resisted all ordinary treatment. The antidote addresses this illness, but notes it only offers temporary relief. The connection between ashen blood and the beast scourge is never made fully explicit, but the evidence suggests that the Healing Church's blood ministration, intended as the cure for ashen blood, was the mechanism by which the beast scourge spread. They treated a disease with blood that carried a worse condition. The blood-starved beast in the locked church of Old Yharnam is the physical record of this chain, a creature that carries both the original ashen blood poison and the subsequent beast transformation in its body simultaneously. Old Yharnam did not simply catch the beast plague. It caught two things at once and was consumed by the combination before anyone with authority acknowledged what the cure was costing. The Nightmare Frontier and the Abandoned. The Nightmare Frontier is an outdoor nightmare accessible through the lecture building's first floor, a broken, cratered landscape of rock and poison fog, populated with enormous alien creatures and scattered remnants of both hunters and scholars. The place feels abandoned in a specific way, not destroyed or violated, but simply forgotten. The winter lanterns that appear on the bridges leading to the Amygdala boss are the same type of creature found in the Nightmare of Mensis, implying that the Frontier and the Mensis nightmare share something in their origin or their maintenance. Items found in the Nightmare Frontier, including a sage's hair and sage's wrists, belong to the scholar enemies there who appeared to be choir members who entered the nightmare to study it and were never retrieved. The amygdala that serves as the area's boss is one of the few fully encountered amygdalae in the game, and its description as a being that inhabits the nightmare and grants boons to hunters who prove themselves places it in an interesting relationship with the moon presence, another cosmic entity managing nightmares and granting permissions. The nightmare frontier is what the cosmos looks like when no one is tending it, beautiful in a desolate way, full of things that were once part of a plan, waiting for something that is never going to return for them. Jura's charred companions. Jura has 3 companions in Old Yharnam, hunters who shared his disillusionment with the hunt and stayed to protect the beasts alongside him. The future press game guide assigns them names and roles, and the items they leave behind tell their individual stories. One wears the charred hunter set, which is described as hunting attire covered in soot and ash, implying its wearer was present for the burning of Old Yharnam and was close enough to the fire that it stained them permanently. This hunter did not survive the nightmare. They appear in the hunter's nightmare, blood-drunk but still facing the beast protectively, still in the posture of a guardian even after madness has taken everything else. Another of the companions encountered in the nightmare wields the Gatling gun that Jura himself once used on his tower. The weapon described as belonging to the youngest of Jura's 3 companions. These figures, scattered across both the waking world and the nightmare, are the after-image of a decision made in Old Yharnam to stop hunting and start protecting. The nightmare captured them for it. The waking world forgot them. Jura alone remained, still standing at his post above the ruins, the last of a group that chose compassion at the worst possible time and paid for it across whatever timeline Bloodborne occupies. The gargoyles on Cainhurst's roof, in the later sections of Forsaken Cainhurst Castle, as you move through the crumbling interior rooms toward the roof and the Martyr Lugarius encounter, you will find 2 large stone gargoyle enemies flanking the approach to the Executioner set that can be looted nearby. These gargoyles are not decorative. They are active, dangerous, and positioned specifically to guard the armor of the Executioners, the religious soldiers who came to Cainhurst to exterminate the Vilebloods. One reading of their presence is architectural. Cainhurst was always a castle defended by such things, and they simply remained after the living defenders were killed. But another reading follows from the Executioner set's placement between them. That Lugarius, when he chose to stay behind and guard the imprisoned Annalise, may have left the Executioner armor there deliberately, as if hanging up the office that had kept him on the roof for so long, marking the spot where he stopped being an executioner and became something more desperate and more personal. The gargoyles guard that moment of laying down the role and taking up the vigil. The armor between them is what he used to be. The crown he left on the ground in front of his throne is what he became. The Healing Church's 3 branches. To understand the full picture of the Healing Church's institutional structure, you have to piece together 3 distinct branches from the game's item descriptions. The main body of the church administered blood healing to Yharnam's population through the Grand Cathedral and its network of clinics. Above that, the choir, marked by their distinctive white and black attire and eye-covering blindfolds, occupied the upper cathedral ward and carried on Bergenwerth's research through direct contact with Ebrietas. Parallel to the choir, the School of Menses, marked by their student-style uniforms and cage-wearing rituals, operated from Yahar'gul in secret, pursuing a separate research program centered on contacting Murgo These three branches knew of each other but maintained institutional separation. The choir's note in Cathedral Ward expressing frustration that the spider hides things from them suggests the choir and the School of Mensis were not sharing information freely. The main church below was almost certainly not informed of either branch's activities in any meaningful detail. The church that ordinary Yarnamites interacted with daily, the one that healed them, that conducted sermons, that sent hunters into the streets on hunt nights, was the public face of an institution whose actual priorities bore almost no relationship to public healing. 3 different organizations, 3 different agendas, 1 name. The bloodletting beast in the Chalice Dungeons. Deep in the Chalice Dungeons, past the layers of Thumerian architecture and the increasingly strange enemies that populate the labyrinths, there are optional bosses that do not appear in the main game. One of the most disturbing is the bloodletting beast, a creature whose body has been split open down the center, revealing a writhing mass of internal tissue and, if encountered in its alternate form, a head full of crawling worms. The bloodletting beast design suggests a transformation process that did not complete. A body that tore itself apart, trying to become something it lacked the structural integrity to contain. The Chalice Dungeon bosses collectively form a taxonomy of failed transformations, of things that were touched by the blood or the Great Ones and did not arrive anywhere coherent. The bloodletting beast is the most visceral of these, not a creature that became monstrous through madness or hubris, but one whose body simply detonated from the inside. It fights with what was exposed in the detonation, wielding its own exposed internal processes as weapons. This is what the blood does when the body cannot contain what the blood is becoming. The Tomb Prospectors and what they found. The Tomb Prospector set, found in the Chalice Dungeons, carries a description noting that Tomb Prospectors were church-affiliated hunters who delved into the Chalice Dungeons specifically to recover artifacts and knowledge from the Thumerian labyrinths. The set notes that the prospectors came to understand that in the labyrinths, something great might be met, implying that the Chalice Dungeon delving was not random archaeology, but deliberate cosmic contact, guided by the understanding that the Great Ones were accessible through the tombs. The prospectors predated the formal choir and existed as an intermediate step between Big and Verth's early explorations and the church's organized programs. They went in looking for blood and artifacts. Some of them found what they were looking for. The ones who came back with the Great Is Chalice, the chalice that gave the choir access to Ebrietas, changed the church's trajectory permanently. The ones who did not come back presumably found things that made returning impossible. The Chalice Dungeons are littered with the evidence of these expeditions. Hunter's gear, old bloodstains, notes that end mid-sentence. The prospectors understood they were looking for something. The ones who found it could not always communicate what it was. Darkbeast Parl's lightning body. When Darkbeast Parl moves, the electricity it generates crackles in visible arcs along the exposed bones and tendons of its enormous frame. It is not simply surrounded by electricity. The lightning runs through it, is generated by it, seems to be the substance of whatever the creature now is, rather than a power it uses. The Spark Hunter badge that Parl drops when defeated belonged to a healing church hunter who, the description implies, specialized in bolt weaponry and understood lightning-type transformations. The connection between the badge and the beast suggests that Parl was once a hunter who worked with electricity as a fighting tool, and that prolonged exposure to the bolt-type power, combined with the beast scourge, eventually converted the hunter's entire body into a walking discharge. The bones are not just exposed, they are conducting. Whatever flesh and organ remained has been replaced or subsumed by the electrical process. Darkbeast Paarl is not a hunter who became a beast and also happens to have lightning. It is a hunter whose lightning became the beast, whose tool became the transformation. The badge is the only thing that survived the conversion in recognizable form, and even it only survives as loot. The two faces of the moon. The moon over Yharnam changes throughout the game in ways tied to the player's progress rather than to any in-world time progression. At the start, it is a full moon, bright, visible, casting long shadows across the rooftops and cobblestones of central Yharnam. As your insight climbs and you progress deeper into the game's events, the moon grows larger, redder, lower in the sky. By the time you have killed Rom and allowed the blood moon to descend, it fills a significant portion of the sky and casts everything in red. This is not atmospheric decoration. The blood moon's descent is tied mechanically and narratively to the progression of the school of Mensis' ritual. As Murgo's nightmare grows more potent, as the connection between the waking world and the nightmare strengthens, the moon, that is physically the presence of a Great One, draws nearer to the city below. The Cainhurst Castle area, uniquely, always exists under a different sky. No blood moon visible there, ever. The castle sits outside the moon presence's sphere of influence, and the contrast between the red sky over Yharnam and the clear, dark sky over Cainhurst is one of the game's subtlest ways of marking the castle as genuinely separate from everything that has been set in motion in the city below.